While the water in the boxes gradually froze, men gave it a stir or two with a stick occasionally, to liberate the air bubbles, I think. Other men were continually lifting out boxes whose contents had become hard frozen. They gave the box a slight dip into a vat of boiling water to melt the block of ice free from its tin coffin. Then they shot the block out upon a platform car, and it was ready for market. These big blocks were hard, solid, and crystal clear. In certain of them, big bouquets of fresh and brilliant tropical flowers had been frozen in. In others, beautiful silken-clad French dolls and other pretty objects. These blocks were to be set on end in a platter in the center of dinner tables to cool the tropical air, and also to be ornamental, for the flowers and things imprisoned in them could be seen as through plate glass. I was told that this factory could retail its ice by wagon throughout New Orleans in the humblest dwelling-house quantities at $6 or $7 a ton and make a sufficient profit. This being the case, there is business for ice factories in the North, for we get ice on no such terms there if one take less than 350 pounds at a delivery. The Rosalie yarn mill of Natchez has a capacity of 6,000 spindles and 160 looms and employs 100 hands. The Natchez Cotton Mills Company began operations 4 years ago in a 2-story building of 50 by 190 feet with 4,000 spindles and 128 looms. Capital $105,000, all subscribed in the town. 2 years later, the same stockholders increased their capital to $225,000, added a 3rd story to the mill, increased its length to 317 feet, added machinery to increase the capacity to 10,300 spindles and 34 looms. The company now employs 250 operatives, many of whom are citizens of Natchez. The mill works 5,000 bales of cotton annually and manufactures the best standard quality of brown shirtings and sheetings and drills, turning out 5 million yards of these goods per year, at least according to the New Orleans Times-Democrat, August 26, 1882. A close corporation, stock held at $5,000 per share, but none in the market. The changes in the Mississippi River are great and strange, yet were to be expected. But I was not expecting to live to see Natchez and these other river towns becoming manufacturing strongholds and railway centers. Speaking of manufactures reminds me of a talk upon that topic which I overheard on board the Cincinnati boat. I woke out of a fretted sleep, with a dull confusion of voices in my ears. I listened. 2 men were talking. Subject, apparently, the great inundation. I looked out through the open transom. The 2 men were eating a late breakfast, sitting opposite each other, nobody else around. They closed up the inundation with a few words, having used it, evidently, as a mere icebreaker and acquaintanceship breeder. Then they dropped into business. It soon transpired that they were drummers, one belonging in Cincinnati, the other in New Orleans. Brisk men, energetic of movement and speech, the dollar their god, how to get it their religion. "Now as to this article," said Cincinnati, slashing into the ostensible butter and holding forward a slab of it on his knife blade. "It's from our house. Look at it, smell of it, taste it. Put any test on it you want to. Take your own time, no hurry, make it thorough. There now, what do you say? Butter, ain't it? Not by a thunderin' sight. It's oleomargarine. Yes, sir, that's what it is, oleomargarine. You can't tell it from butter. By George, an expert can't. It's from our house. We supply most of the boats in the West. There's hardly a pound of butter on one of them. We are crawling right along, jumping right along as a world. We are going to have that entire trade. Yes, the hotel trade, too. And you're going to see the day pretty soon when you can't find an ounce of butter to bless yourself with in any hotel in the Mississippi and Ohio valleys outside of the biggest cities. While we are turning out oleomargarine now by the thousands of tons, and we can sell it so dirt cheap that the whole country's got to take it. Can't get around it, you see. Butter don't stand any show. There ain't any chance for competition. Butter's had its day, and from this out, butter goes to the wall. There's more money in oleomargarine than... you can't imagine the business we do. I've stopped in every town from Cincinnati to Natchez, and I've sent home big orders from every one of them. and so forth and so on for 10 minutes longer, in the same fervid strain. Then New Orleans piped up and said, "Yes, it's a first-rate imitation, that's a certainty. But it ain't the only one around that's first-rate. For instance, they make olive oil out of cottonseed oil nowadays, so you can't tell 'em apart." "Yes, that's so," replied Cincinnati, "and it was a tip-top business for a while. They sent it over and brought it back from France and Italy, with the United States Custom House mark on it to endorse it for genuine, and there was no end of cash in it. But France and Italy broke up that game. Of course, they naturally would. Cracked on such a rattling impost that cottonseed olive oil couldn't stand a raise, had to hang up and quit." "Oh, it did it? You wait here a minute." Goes to his stateroom, brings back a couple of long bottles and takes out the corks. Says, "There now, smell 'em, taste 'em, examine the bottles, inspect the labels. One of 'em's from Europe, the other of 'em's never been out of this country. One's European olive oil, the other's American cottonseed olive oil. Tell 'em apart." "Of course you can't. Nobody can. People that want to can go to the expense and trouble of shipping their oils to Europe and back. It's their privilege. But our firm knows a trick worth 6 of that. We turn out the whole thing, clean from the word go, in our factory in New Orleans. Labels, bottles, oil, everything. Well, no, not labels. Been buying them abroad. Get 'em dirt cheap there. You see, there's just one little wee speck, essence or whatever it is, in a gallon of cottonseed oil that gives it a smell or a flavor or something. Get that out and you're all right. Perfectly easy then to turn the oil into any kind of oil you want it. And there ain't anybody that can detect the true from the false. Well, we know how to get that one little particle out. And we're the only firm that does. And we turn out an olive oil that's just simply perfect, undetectable. We're doing a ripping trade, too, as I could easily show you by my order book for this trip. Maybe you'll butter everybody's bread pretty soon, but we'll cottonseed this salad for 'em from the Gulf to Canada. That's a dead certain thing." Cincinnati glowed and flashed with admiration. The two scoundrels exchanged business cards and arose. As they left the table, Cincinnati said, "But you have to have custom house marks, don't you? How do you manage that?" I didn't catch the answer. We passed Port Hudson, scene of 2 of the most terrific episodes of the war. The night battle there between Farragut's fleet and the Confederate land batteries, April 14th, 1863, and the memorable land battle 2 months later, which lasted 8 hours. 8 hours of exceptionally fierce and stubborn fighting, and ended, finally, in the repulse of the Union forces with great slaughter.
This ends Disc 8, Life on the Mississippi, Disc 9.
Chapter 40. Castles and Culture. Baton Rouge was clothed in flowers like a bride. No, much more so, like a greenhouse. For we were in the absolute South now. No modifications, no compromises, no halfway measures. The magnolia trees in the Capitol grounds were lovely and fragrant, with their dense, rich foliage and huge snowball blossoms. The scent of the flower is very sweet, but you want distance on it because it is so powerful. They're not good bedroom blossoms. They might suffocate one in his sleep. We were certainly in the South at last. For here the sugar region begins, and the plantations, vast green levels with sugar mill and Negro quarters clustered together in the middle distance, were in view. And there was a tropical sun overhead, and a tropical swelter in the air. And at this point, also, begins the pilot's paradise. A wide river, hence to New Orleans, abundance of water from shore to shore, with no bars, snags, sawyers, or wrecks in his road. Sir Walter Scott is probably responsible for the Capitol building, for it is not conceived that this little sham castle would ever have been built if he had not run people mad a couple of generations ago with his medieval romances. The South has not yet recovered from the debilitating influence of his books. Admiration of his fantastic heroes and their grotesque chivalry doings and romantic juvenilities still survives here in an atmosphere in which is already perceptible the wholesome and practical 19th century smell of cotton factories and locomotives. and traces of its inflated language and other windy humbuggeries survive along with it. It's pathetic enough that a whitewashed castle with turrets and things, materials all ungenuine within and without, pretending to be what they are not, should ever have been built in this otherwise honorable place. But it's much more pathetic to see this architectural falsehood undergoing restoration, perpetuation in our day, when it would have been so easy to let dynamite finish what a charitable fire began, and then devote this restoration money to the building of something genuine. Baton Rouge has no patent on imitation castles, however, and no monopoly of them. The following remark is from the advertisement of the Female Institute of Columbia, Tennessee. The Institute building has long been famed as a model of striking and beautiful architecture. Visitors are charmed with its resemblance to the old castles of song and story, with its towers, turreted walls, and ivy-mantled porches. Keeping school in a castle is a romantic thing, as romantic as keeping a hotel in a castle. By itself, the imitation castle is doubtless harmless, and well enough. But as a symbol and breeder and sustainer of maudlin middle-age romanticism, here in the midst of the plainest and sturdiest and infinitely greatest and worthiest of all the centuries the world has seen, it is necessarily a hurtful thing and a mistake. Here is an extract from the prospectus of a Kentucky female college. Female college sounds well enough, but since the phrasing it in that unjustifiable way was done purely in the interest of brevity, it seems to me that she college would have been still better, because shorter, and means the same thing. That is, if either phrase means anything at all. The President is Southern by birth, by rearing, by education, and by sentiment. The teachers are all Southern in sentiment, and with the exception of those born in Europe, were born and raised in the South. Believing the Southern to be the highest type of civilization this continent has seen, the young ladies are trained according to the Southern ideas of delicacy, refinement, womanhood, religion, and propriety. Hence, we offer a first-class female college for the South, and solicit Southern patronage. What Warder Ho, the man that can blow so complacent a blast as that, probably blows it from a castle. Here are a few illustrations of this highest type of civilization, thoughtlessly omitted by the advertiser. Knoxville, Tennessee, October 19. This morning, a few minutes after 10 o'clock, General Joseph A. Mabry, Thomas O'Connor, and Joseph A. Mabry, Jr. were killed in a shooting affray. The difficulty began yesterday afternoon by General Mabry attacking Major O'Connor and threatening to kill him. This was at the fairgrounds, and O'Connor told Mabry that it was not the place to settle their difficulties. Mabry then told O'Connor he should not live. It seems that Mabry was armed and O'Connor was not. The cause of the difficulty was an old feud about the transfer of some property from Mabry to O'Connor. Later in the afternoon, Mabry sent word to O'Connor that he would kill him on sight. This morning, Major O'Connor was standing in the door of the Mechanics' National Bank, of which he was president. General Mabry and another gentleman walked down Gay Street on the opposite side from the bank. O'Connor stepped into the bank, got a shotgun, took deliberate aim at General Mabry, and fired. Mabry fell dead, being shot in the left side. As he fell, O'Connor fired again, the shot taking effect in Mabry's thigh. O'Connor then reached into the bank and got another shotgun. About this time, Joseph A. Mabry, Jr., son of General Mabry, came rushing down the street, unseen by O'Connor, until within 40 feet, when the young man fired a pistol, the shot taking effect in O'Connor's right breast, passing through the body near the heart. The instant Mabry shot, O'Connor turned and fired, the load taking effect in young Mabry's right breast and side. Mabry fell, pierced with 20 buckshot, and almost instantly O'Connor fell dead, without a struggle. Mabry tried to rise, but fell back dead. The whole tragedy occurred within 2 minutes, and neither of the three spoke after he was shot. General Mabry had about 30 buckshot in his body. A bystander was painfully wounded in the thigh with a buckshot, and another was wounded in the arm. 4 other men had their clothing pierced by buckshot. The affair caused great excitement, and Gay Street was thronged with thousands of people. General Mabry and his son Joe were acquitted only a few days ago of the murder of Moses Lusby and Don Lusby, father and son, whom they killed a few weeks ago. Will Mabry was killed by Don Lusby last Christmas. Major Thomas O'Connor was president of the Mechanics' National Bank here, and the wealthiest man in the state. That was from the Associated Press telegram. And these are extracts from the public journals. One day last month, Professor Sharp of the Somerville, Tennessee Female College, a quiet and gentlemanly man, was told that his brother-in-law, a Captain Burton, had threatened to kill him. Burton, it seems, had already killed one man and driven his knife into another. The professor armed himself with a double-barreled shotgun, started out in search of his brother-in-law, found him playing billiards in a saloon, and blew his brains out. The Memphis Avalanche reports that the professor's course met with pretty general approval in the community. Knowing that the law was powerless, in the actual condition of public sentiment, to protect him, he protected himself. About the same time, 2 young men in North Carolina quarreled about a girl, and hostile messages were exchanged. Friends tried to reconcile them, but had their labor for their pains. On the 24th, the young men met in the public highway. One of them had a heavy club in his hand, the other an axe. The man with the club fought desperately for his life, but it was a hopeless fight from the first. A well-directed blow sent his club whirling out of his grasp, and the next moment he was a dead man. About the same time, the 2 highly connected young Virginians, clerks in a hardware store at Charlottesville, while skylarking, came to blows. Peter Dick threw pepper in Charles Rhodes' eyes. Rhodes demanded an apology. Dick refused to give it, and it was agreed that a duel was inevitable. But a difficulty arose. The parties had no pistols, and it was too late at night to procure them. One of them suggested that butcher knives would answer the purpose, and the other accepted the suggestion. The result was that Rhodes fell to the floor with a gash in his abdomen that may or may not prove fatal. If Dick has been arrested, the news has not reached us. He expressed deep regret, and we are told by a Stanton correspondent of the Philadelphia Press that every effort has been made to hush the matter up. From Baton Rouge to New Orleans, the great sugar plantations border both sides of the river all the way, and stretch their league-wide levels back to the dim forest walls of bearded cypress in the rear. Shores lonely no longer. Plenty of dwellings all the way on both banks, standing so close together for long distances that the broad river lying between the 2 rows becomes a sort of spacious street, a most homelike and happy-looking region. And now and then you see a pillared and porticoed great manor house embowered in trees. Here is testimony of 1 or 2 of the procession of foreign tourists that filed along here half a century ago. Mrs. Trollope says, "The unbroken flatness of the banks of the Mississippi continued unvaried for many miles above New Orleans. But the graceful and luxuriant palmetto, the dark and noble ilex, and the bright orange were everywhere to be seen, and it was many days before we were weary of looking at them." Captain Basil Hall, the district of country which lies adjacent to the Mississippi in the lower parts of Louisiana, is everywhere thickly peopled by sugar planters, whose showy houses, gray piazzas, trig gardens, and numerous slave villages, all clean and neat, gave an exceedingly thriving air to the river scenery. All the procession paint the attractive picture in the same way. The descriptions of 50 years ago do not need to have a word changed in order to exactly describe the same region as it appears today, except as to the trigness of the houses. The whitewash is gone from the Negro cabins now, and many, possibly most, of the big mansions, once so shining white, have worn out their paint and have a decayed, neglected look. It's the blight of the war. 21 years ago, everything was trim and trig and bright along the coast, just as it had been in 1827, as described by those tourists. Unfortunate tourists. People humbugged them with stupid and silly lies, and then laughed at them for believing and printing the same. They told Mrs. Trollope that the alligators, or crocodiles as she calls them, were terrible creatures, and backed up the statement with a blood-curdling account of how one of these slandered reptiles crept into a squatter cabin one night and ate up a woman and 5 children. The woman by herself would have satisfied any ordinarily impossible alligator, but no, these liars must make him gorge the 5 children besides. One would not imagine that jokers of this robust breed would be sensitive, but they were. It's difficult at this day to understand, and impossible to justify, the reception which the book of the grave, honest, intelligent, gentle, manly, charitable, well-meaning Captain Basil Hall got. Mrs. Trollope's account of it may perhaps entertain the reader. Therefore, I've put it in the appendix. Chapter 41. The Metropolis of the South. The approaches to New Orleans were familiar. General aspects were unchanged. When one goes flying through London along a railway, propped in the air on tall arches, he may inspect miles of upper bedrooms through the open windows, but the lower half of the houses is under his level and out of sight. Similarly, in High River Stage, in the New Orleans region, the water is up to the top of the enclosing levee rim. The flat country behind it lies low, representing the bottom of a dish, and as the boat swims along, high on the flood, one looks down upon the houses and into the upper windows. There's nothing but that frail breastwork of earth between the people and destruction. The old brick salt warehouses clustered at the upper end of the city looked as they had always looked. Warehouses which had had a kind of Aladdin's lamp experience, however, since I had seen them. For when the war broke out, the proprietor went to bed one night, leaving them packed with thousands of sacks of vulgar salt worth a couple of dollars a sack, and got up in the morning and found his mountain of salt turned into a mountain of gold, so to speak. So suddenly, and so dizzy a height, had the war news sent up the price of the article. The vast reach of plank wharves remained unchanged, and there were as many ships as ever. But the long array of steamboats had vanished. Not altogether, of course, but not much of it was left. The city itself had not changed, to the eye. It had greatly increased in spread and population, but the look of the town was not altered. The dust, waste-paper littered, was still deep in the streets. The deep, trough-like gutters along the curbstones were still half full of reposeful water with a dusty surface. The sidewalks were still, in the sugar and bacon region, encumbered by casks and barrels and hogsheads. The great blocks of austerely plain commercial houses were as dusty-looking as ever. Canal Street was finer and more attractive and stirring than formerly, with its drifting crowds of people, its several processions of hurrying streetcars, and, toward evening, its broad second-story verandas crowded with gentlemen and ladies clothed according to the latest mode. Not that there is any architecture in Canal Street. To speak in broad, general terms, there is no architecture in New Orleans, except in the cemeteries. It seems a strange thing to say of a wealthy, far-seeing, and energetic city of 250,000 inhabitants, but it's true. There's a huge granite United States Customs House, costly enough, genuine enough, but as to decoration, it is inferior to a gasometer. It looks like a state prison. But it was built before the war. Architecture in America may be said to have been born since the war. New Orleans, I believe, has had the good luck, and in a sense the bad luck, to have had no great fire in late years. It must be so. If the opposite had been the case, I think one would be able to tell the burnt district by the radical improvements in its architecture over the old forms. One can do this in Boston and Chicago. The burnt district of Boston was commonplace before the fire, but now there's no commercial district in any city in the world that can surpass it, or perhaps even rival it in beauty, elegance, and tastefulness. However, New Orleans has begun, just this moment, as one may say. When completed, the new Cotton Exchange will be a stately and beautiful building, massive, substantial, full of architectural graces. No shams or false pretenses or ugliness about it anywhere. To the city, it'll be worth many times its cost, for it will breed its species. What has been lacking hitherto was a model to build toward, something to educate eye and taste, a suggester, so to speak. The city is well outfitted with progressive men, thinking, sagacious, long-headed men. The contrast between the spirit of the city and the city's architecture is like the contrast between waking and sleep. Apparently, there is a boom in everything but that one dead feature. The water in the gutters used to be stagnant and slimy, and a potent disease breeder, but the gutters are flushed now 2 or 3 times a day by powerful machinery. In many of the gutters, the water never stands still, but has a steady current. Other sanitary improvements have been made, and with such effect that New Orleans claims to be, during the long intervals between the occasional yellow fever assaults, one of the healthiest cities in the Union. There's plenty of ice now for everybody, manufactured in the town. It's a driving place commercially, and has a great river, ocean, and railway business. At the date of our visit, it was the best lighted city in the Union, electrically speaking. The New Orleans electric lights were more numerous than those of New York, and very much better. One had this modified noonday not only in Canal and some neighboring chief streets, but all along a stretch of 5 miles of river frontage. There are good clubs in the city now, several of them but recently organized, and inviting modern-style pleasure resorts at West End and Spanish Fort. The telephone is everywhere. One of the most notable advances is in journalism. The newspapers, as I remember them, were not a striking feature. Now they are. Money is spent upon them with a free hand. They get the news, let it cost what it may. The editorial work is not hack-grinding, but literature. As an example of the New Orleans journalistic achievement, it may be mentioned that the Times Democrat of August 26, 1882, contained a report of the year's business of the towns of the Mississippi Valley, from New Orleans all the way to St. Paul, 2,000 miles. That issue of the paper consisted of 40 pages, 7 columns to the page, 280 columns in all, 1,500 words to the column, an aggregate of 420,000 words. That's to say, not much short of 3 times as many words as are in this book. One may with sorrow contrast this with the architecture of New Orleans. I have been speaking of public architecture only. The domestic article in New Orleans is reproachless, notwithstanding it remains as it always was. All the dwellings are of wood, in the American part of town, I mean, and all have a comfortable look. Those in the wealthy quarter are spacious, painted snow-white usually, and generally have wide verandas or double verandas supported by ornamental columns. These mansions stand in the center of large grounds and rise garlanded with roses out of the midst of swelling masses of shining green foliage and many-colored blossoms. No houses could well be in better harmony with their surroundings, or more pleasing to the eye, or more homelike and comfortable-looking. One even becomes reconciled to the cistern presently. This is a mighty cask, painted green, and sometimes a couple of stories high, which is propped against the house corner on stilts. There's a mansion and brewery suggestion about the combination which seems very incongruous at first, but the people cannot have wells, and so they take rainwater. Neither can they conveniently have cellars or graves, the town being built upon made ground. So they do without both, and few of the living complain, and none of the others. The Israelites are buried in graves, by permission, I take it, not requirement, but none else except the destitute, who are buried at public expense. The graves are but 3 or 4 feet deep. Chapter 42. Hygiene and Sentiment. They bury their dead in vaults above the ground. These vaults have a resemblance to houses, sometimes to temples, and are built of marble generally, are architecturally graceful and shapely. They face the walks and driveways of the cemetery, and when one moves through the midst of 1,000 or so of them and sees their white roofs and gables stretching into the distance on every hand, the phrase "City of the Dead" has all at once a meaning to him. Many of the cemeteries are beautiful and are kept in perfect order. When one goes from the levee or the business streets near it to a cemetery, he observes to himself that if those people down there would live as neatly while they are alive as they do after they are dead, they would find many advantages in it. And besides, their quarter would be the wonder and admiration of the business world. Fresh flowers in vases of water are to be seen at the portals of many of the vaults, placed there by the pious hands of bereaved parents and children, husbands and wives, and renewed daily. A milder form of sorrow finds its inexpensive and lasting remembrancer in the coarse and ugly but indestructible immortelle, which is a wreath or cross or some such emblem made of rosettes of black linen, with sometimes a yellow rosette at the junction of the cross's bars, kind of sorrowful breastpin, so to say. The immortelle requires no attention. You just hang it up and there you are. Just leave it alone. It'll take care of your grief for you, and keep it in mind better than you can. Stands weather first-rate and lasts like boiler iron. On sunny days, pretty little chameleons, gracefulest of legged reptiles, creep along the marble fronts of the vaults and catch flies. Their changes of color, as to variety, are not up to the creature's reputation. They change color when a person comes along and hangs up an immortelle, but that is nothing. Any right-feeling reptile would do that. I will gradually drop this subject of graveyards. I've been trying all I could to get down to the sentimental part of it, but I cannot accomplish it. I think there is no genuinely sentimental part to it. It is all grotesque, ghastly, horrible. Graveyards may have been justifiable in the bygone ages, when nobody knew that for every dead body put into the ground to glut the earth and the plant roots and the air with disease germs, 5 or 50 or maybe 100 persons must die before their proper time. But they are hardly justifiable now, when even the children know that a dead saint enters upon a century-long career of assassination the moment the earth closes over his corpse. It is a grim sort of a thought. The relics of St. Anne up in Canada have now, after 1900 years, gone to curing the sick by the dozen. But it is merest matter of course that these same relics, within a generation after St. Anne's death and burial, made several thousand people sick. Therefore, these miracle performances are simply compensation, nothing more. St. Anne is somewhat slow pay for a saint, it is true, but better a debt paid after 1900 years and outlawed by the statute of limitation than not paid at all, and most of the knights of the halo do not pay at all. Where you find one that pays, like St. Anne, you find 150 that take the benefit of the statute, and none of them pay any more than the principal of what they owe. They pay none of the interest, either simple or compound. A saint can never quite return the principal, however, for his dead body kills people, whereas his relics heal only. They never restore the dead to life. That part of the account is always left unsettled. Dr. F. Julius Lemoyne, after 50 years of medical practice, wrote, "The inhumation of human bodies, dead from infectious diseases, results in constantly loading the atmosphere and polluting the waters with not only the germs that rise from simply putrefaction, but also with the specific germs of the diseases from which death resulted. The gases, from buried corpses, will rise to the surface through 8 or 10 feet of gravel, just as coal gas will do, and there's practically no limit to their power of escape. During the epidemic in New Orleans in 1853, Dr. E. H. Barton reported that in the 4th District, the mortality was 452,000, more than double that of any other. In this district were 3 large cemeteries, in which, during the previous year, more than 3,000 bodies had been buried. In other districts, the proximity of cemeteries seemed to aggravate the disease. In 1828, Professor Bianchi demonstrated how the fearful reappearance of the plague at Modena was caused by excavations in ground where 300 years previously the victims of the pestilence had been buried. Mr. Cooper, in explaining the causes of some epidemics, remarks that the opening of the plague burial grounds at Em resulted in an immediate outbreak of the disease. This from the North American Review, No. 3, Volume 135. In an address before the Chicago Medical Society, in advocacy of cremation, Dr. Charles W. Purdy made some striking comparisons to show what a burden is laid upon society by the burial of the dead. 1 1/4 times more money is expended annually in funerals in the United States than the government expends for public school purposes. Funerals cost this country in 1880 enough money to pay the liabilities of all the commercial failures in the United States during the same year, and give each bankrupt a capital of $8,630 with which to resume business. Funerals cost annually more money than the value of the combined gold and silver yield of the United States in the year 1880. These figures do not include the sums invested in burial grounds and expended in tombs and monuments, nor the loss from depreciation of property in the vicinity of cemeteries. For the rich, cremation would answer as well as burial, for the ceremonies connected with it could be made as costly and ostentatious as a Hindu sati, while for the poor, cremation would be better than burial because so cheap, $4 or $5 is the minimum cost. So cheap until the poor got to imitating the rich, which they would do by and by. The adoption of cremation would relieve us of a muck of threadbare burial witticisms. But on the other hand, it would resurrect a lot of mildewed old cremation jokes that have had a rest for 2,000 years. I have a colored acquaintance who earns his living by odd jobs and heavy manual labor. He never earns above $400 a year, and as he has a wife and several young children, the closest scrimping is necessary to get him through to the end of the 12 months debtless. To such a man, a funeral is a colossal financial disaster. While I was writing one of the preceding chapters, this man lost a little child. He walked the town over with a friend, trying to find a coffin that was within his means. He bought the very cheapest one he could find, plain wood, stained. It cost him $26. It would have cost less than $4, probably, if it had been built to put something useful into. He and his family will feel that outlay a good many months. Chapter 43. The Art of Inhumation. About the same time, I encountered a man in the street whom I had not seen for 6 or 7 years, and something like this talk followed. I said, "But you used to look sad and oldish. You don't now. Where'd you get all this youth and bubbling cheerfulness? Give me the address." He chuckled blithely, took off his shining tile, pointed to a notched pink circlet of paper pasted into its crown, with something lettered on it, and went on chuckling while I read, J.B., Undertaker. Then he clapped his hat on, gave it an irreverent tilt to leeward, and cried out, "That's what's the matter. It used to be rough times with me when you knew me. Insurance agency business, you know, mighty irregular. Big fire, all right. Brisk trade for 10 days while people scared. After that, dull policy business till next fire. Town like this don't have fires often enough. A fella strikes so many dull weeks in a row that he gets discouraged. But you bet you this is the business. People don't wait for examples to die. No, sir, they drop off right along. There ain't any dull spots in the undertaker line. I just started in with 2 or 3 little old coffins and a hired hearse, and now look at the thing. I've worked up a business here that'd satisfy any man, don't care who he is. 5 years ago, lodged in an attic. Live in a swell house now, with a mansard roof and all the modern inconveniences. Does a coffin pay so well? Is there much profit on a coffin? Go away, how you talk." Then, with a confidential wink, a dropping of the voice, and an impressive laying of his hand on my arm, "Look here, there's one thing in this world which isn't ever cheap. That's a coffin. There's one thing in this world which a person don't ever try to Jew you down on. That's a coffin. There's one thing in this world which a person don't say, 'I'll look around a little, and if I find I can't do better, I'll come back and take it.' That's a coffin. There's one thing in this world which a person won't take in pine if he can go walnut, and won't take in walnut if he can go an iron casket with silver doorplate and bronze handles. That's a coffin. And there's one thing in this world which you don't have to worry around after a person to get him to pay for, and that's a coffin. Undertaking? Why, it's the dead surest business in Christendom, and the knobbiest. Well, just look at it. A rich man won't have anything but your very best. And you can just pile it on, too. Pile it on and sock it to him. He won't even holler. And you take in a poor man, and if you work him right, he'll bust himself on a single layout. Or especially a woman. For instance, Miss O'Flaherty comes in, widow, wiping her eyes and kind of moaning. On handkerchiefs, one eye, bats it around tearfully over the stock, says, "And what might you ask for that one?" $39, madam, says I. "That's a fine, big price, sure, but Pat shall be buried like a gentleman, as he was. If I have to work my fingers off for it, I'll have that one, sir." "Yes, madam," says I. "And it is a very good one, too. Not costly, to be sure, but in this life we must cut our garments to our cloth, as the saying is." And as she starts out, I heave in kind of casually, "This one with the white satin lining is a beauty, but I'm afraid, well, $65 is rather, but no matter, I felt obliged to say to Mrs. O'Shaughnessy." "Do you mean to say that Bridget O'Shaughnessy bought the mate to that jewel box to ship that drunken divil to purgatory in?" "Yes, madam." "Then Pat shall go to heaven in the twin to it, if it takes the last rap the O'Flahertys can raise. And mind you, stick on some extras, too, and I'll give you another $1. And as I lay in with the livery stables, of course, I don't forget to mention that Mrs. O'Shaughnessy hired $54 worth of hacks and flung as much style into Dennis's funeral as if he'd been a duke or an assassin. And of course she sails in and goes the O'Shaughnessy about 4 hacks and an omnibus better. That used to be. But that's all played now. That is, in this particular town. The Irish got to piling up hacks so on their funerals that a funeral left 'em ragged and hungry for 2 years afterward. So the priest pitched in and broke it all up. He don't allow 'em to have but 2 hacks now, and sometimes only 1. "Well," said I, "if you are so light-hearted and jolly in ordinary times, what must you be in an epidemic?" He shook his head. "Now you're off there. I don't like to see an epidemic. An epidemic don't pay. Well, of course I don't mean that exactly, but it don't pay in proportion to the regular thing. Don't it occur to you why?" "No." "Think."
"Well, I can't imagine. What is it?"
"It's just 2 things.
"Well, what are they?"
One's embalming."
"And what's the other?"
"Ice."
"How's that?"
"Well, in ordinary times, a person dies, and we lay him up on ice 1 day, 2 days, maybe 3, to wait for friends to come. Takes a lot of it, melts fast. We charge jewelry rates for that ice, and war prices for attendance. Well, don't you know, when there's an epidemic, they rush 'em to the cemetery the minute the breath's out. No market for ice in an epidemic. Same with embalming. You take a family that's able to embalm, and you got a soft thing. You can mention 16 different ways to do it, though there ain't only 1 or 2 ways when you come down to the bottom facts of it. And they'll take the highest price way every time. It's human nature and grief. It don't reason, you see. Time being, it don't care a damn. All it wants is physical immortality for a deceased, and they're willing to pay for it. All you got to do is just be calm and stack it up. They'll stand the racket. Well, man, you can take a defunct that you couldn't give away and get your embalming traps around you and go to work, and in a couple hours he's worth a cool 600. That's what he's worth. There ain't anything equal to it but trading rats for diamonds in time of famine. Well, don't you see, when there's an epidemic, people don't wait to embalm. No, indeed they don't, and it hurts. Hurts a business like health, as we say. Hurts like health. Health, see? Our little joke in the trade. Well, I must be going. Give me a call whenever you need any. I mean, when you're going by sometime.
In his joyful high spirits, he did the exaggerating himself, if any had been done. I have not enlarged on him. With the above brief references to inhumation, let us leave the subject. As for me, I hope to be cremated. I made that remark to my pastor once, who said, with what he seemed to think was an impressive manner, "I wouldn't worry about that if I had your chances." Much he knew about it, the family all so opposed to it. Chapter 44. City Sights. The old French part of New Orleans, anciently the Spanish part, bears no resemblance to the American end of the city. The American end, which lies beyond the intervening brick business center. The houses are massed in blocks, are austerely plain and dignified, uniform of pattern, with here and there a departure from it with pleasant effect. All are plastered on the outside, and nearly all have long iron-railed verandas running along the several stories. Their chief beauty is the deep, warm, varicolored stain with which time and the weather have enriched the plaster. It harmonizes with all the surroundings, and has as natural a look of belonging there as has the flush upon sunset clouds. This charming decoration cannot be successfully imitated. Neither is it to be found elsewhere in America. The iron railings are a specialty also. The pattern is often exceedingly light and dainty and airy and graceful, with a large cipher or monogram in the center, delicate cobweb of baffling, intricate forms wrought in steel. The ancient railings are handmade, and are now comparatively rare and proportionately valuable. They are become bric-a-brac. The party had the privilege of idling through this ancient quarter of New Orleans with the South's finest literary genius, the author of The Grandissimes. In him the South has found a masterly delineator of its interior life and its history. In truth, I find by experience that the untrained eye and vacant mind can inspect it and learn of it and judge of it more clearly and more profitably in his books than by personal contact with it. With Mr. Cable along to see for you and describe and explain and illuminate, a jog through that old quarter is a vivid pleasure, and you have a vivid sense as of unseen or dimly seen things, vivid and yet fitful and darkling. You glimpse salient features, but lose the fine shades, or catch them imperfectly through the vision of the imagination, a case, as it were, of an ignorant, near-sighted stranger traversing the rim of wide, vague horizons of Alps with an inspired and enlightened, long-sighted native. We visited the old St. Louis Hotel, now occupied by municipal offices. There is nothing strikingly remarkable about it, but one can say of it, as of the Academy of Music in New York, that if a broom or a shovel has ever been used in it, there is no circumstantial evidence to back up the fact. It is curious that cabbages and hay and things do not grow in the Academy of Music, but no doubt it is on account of the interruption of the light by the benches, and the impossibility of hoeing the crop except in the aisles. The fact that the ushers grow their buttonhole bouquets on the premises shows what might be done if they had the right kind of an agricultural head to the establishment. We visited also the venerable cathedral and the pretty square in front of it, the one dim with religious light, the other brilliant with the worldly sort, and lovely with orange trees and blossomy shrubs. Then we drove in the hot sun through the wilderness of houses and out onto the wide, dead level beyond, where the villas are, and the water wheels to drain the town, and the commons populous with cows and children, passing by an old cemetery where we were told lie the ashes of an early pirate. But we took him on trust and did not visit him. He was a pirate with a tremendous and sanguinary history, and as long as he persevered unspotted in retirement, the dignity of his name and the grandeur of his ancient calling, homage and reverence were his from high and low. But when at last he descended into politics and became a paltry alderman, the public shook him and turned aside and wept. When he died, they set up a monument over him, and little by little he has come into respect again. But it is respect for the pirate, not the alderman. Today, the loyal and generous remember only what he was, and charitably forget what he became. Thence we drove a few miles across a swamp, along a raised shell road with a canal on one hand and a dense wood on the other, and here and there in the distance a ragged and angular-limbed and moss-bearded cypress top standing out clear-cut against the sky, and as quaint of form as the apple trees in Japanese pictures. Such was our course and the surroundings of it. There was an occasional alligator swimming comfortably along in the canal, and an occasional picturesque colored person on the bank, flinging his statue-rigid reflection upon the still water and watching for a bite. And by we reached the West End, a collection of hotels of the usual light summer resort pattern, with broad verandas all around, and the waves of the wide and blue Lake Pontchartrain lapping at the thresholds. We had dinner on a ground veranda over the water. The chief dish, the renowned fish called pompano, delicious as the less criminal forms of sin. Thousands of people come by rail and carriage to West End and to Spanish Fort every evening, and dine, listen to the bands, take strolls in the open air under the electric lights, go sailing on the lake, and entertain themselves in various and sundry other ways. We had opportunities on other days and in other places to test the pompano, notably at an editorial dinner at one of the clubs in the city. He was in his last possible perfection there, and justified his fame. In his suite was a tall pyramid of scarlet crayfish, large ones, as large as one's thumb, delicate, palatable, appetizing. Also deviled whitebait, also shrimps of choice quality, and a platter of small, soft-shell crabs of a most superior breed. The other dishes were what one might get at Delmonico's or Buckingham Palace. Those I have spoken of can be had in similar perfection in New Orleans only, I suppose. In the West and South, they have a new institution, the Broom Brigade. It is composed of young ladies who dress in a uniform costume and go through the infantry drill with broom in place of musket. It is a very pretty sight on private view. When they perform on the stage of a theater, in the blaze of colored fires, it must be a fine and fascinating spectacle. I saw them go through their complex manual with grace, spirit, and admirable precision. I saw them do everything which a human being can possibly do with a broom except sweep. I did not see them sweep, but I know they could learn. What they have already learned proves that. And if they ever should learn, and should go on the warpath down Chupitolas or some of those other streets around there, those thoroughfares would bear a greatly improved aspect in a very few minutes. But the girls themselves wouldn't, so nothing would be really gained after all. The drill was in the Washington Artillery Building. In this building we saw many interesting relics of the war, also a fine oil painting representing Stonewall Jackson's last interview with General Lee. Both men are on horseback. Jackson has just ridden up and is accosting Lee. The picture is very valuable on account of the portraits, which are authentic. But like many another historical picture, it means nothing without its label, and one label will fit it as well as another. First interview between Lee and Jackson. Last interview between Lee and Jackson. Jackson introducing himself to Lee. Jackson accepting Lee's invitation to dinner. Jackson declining Lee's invitation to dinner, with thanks. Jackson apologizing for a heavy defeat. Jackson reporting a great victory. Jackson asking Lee for a match. It tells one story, and a sufficient one, for it says quite plainly and satisfactorily, "Here are Lee and Jackson together." The artist would have made it tell that this is Lee and Jackson's last interview if he could have done it. But he couldn't, for there wasn't any way to do it. A good, legible label is usually worth, for information, a ton of significant attitude and expression in a historical picture. In Rome, people with fine, sympathetic natures stand up and weep in front of the celebrated Beatrice Cenci the day before her execution. It shows what a label can do. If they did not know the picture, they would inspect it unmoved and say, "Young girl with hay fever, young girl with her head in a bag." I found the half-forgotten southern intonations and elisions as pleasing to my ear as they had formerly been. A Southerner talks music. At least, it is music to me. But then I was born in the South. The educated Southerner has no use for an R except at the beginning of a word. He says "Anna," and "dinner," and "governor," and "before," and "the war," and so on. The words may lack charm to the eye in print, but they have it to the ear. When did the R disappear from Southern speech, and how did it come to disappear? The custom of dropping it was not borrowed from the North, nor inherited from England. Many Southerners, most Southerners, put a Y into occasional words that begin with the K sound. For instance, they say Mr. Carter, and speak of playing cards or of riding in the cars. And they have the pleasant custom, long ago fallen into decay in the North, of frequently employing the respectful "sir" instead of the curt "yes" and the abrupt "no." They say "yes, sir," "no, sir." But there are some infelicities, such as "like" for "as," and the addition of an "at" where it isn't needed. I heard an educated gentleman say, "like the flag officer did." His cook or his butler would have said, "like the flag officer done." You hear gentlemen say, "Where have you been at?" And here is the aggravated form, heard a ragged street Arab say it to a comrade. "I was a-asking Tom where you was a-settin' at." The very elect carelessly say "will" when they mean "shall." And many of them say, "I didn't go to do it," meaning I didn't mean to do it. The northern word "guess," imported from England, where it used to be common, and now regarded by satirical Englishmen as a Yankee original, is but little used among Southerners. They say "reckon." They haven't any "doesn't" in their language. They say "don't" instead. The unpolished often use "went" for "gone." It's nearly as bad as the northern "hadn't ought." This reminds me that a remark of a very peculiar nature was made here in my neighborhood, in the North, a few days ago. "He hadn't ought to have went." How's that? Isn't that a good deal of a triumph? One knows the orders combined in this half-breed's architecture without inquiring. One parent Northern, the other Southern. Today I heard a schoolmistress ask, "Where is John gone?" This form is so common, so nearly universal, in fact, that if she had used "whither" instead of "where," I think it would have sounded like an affectation. We picked up one excellent word, a word worth traveling to New Orleans to get. A nice, limber, expressive, handy word. Lagniappe, as they pronounce it. It's Spanish, so they said. We discovered it at the head of a column of odds and ends in the Picayune the first day. Heard 20 people use it the second. Inquired what it meant the third. Adopted it and got facility in swinging it the fourth. It has a restricted meaning, but I think the people spread it out a little when they choose. It is the equivalent of the 13th roll in a baker's dozen. It's something thrown in gratis for good measure. The custom originated in the Spanish quarter of the city. When a child or a servant buys something in a shop, or even the mayor or the governor, for aught I know, he finishes the operation by saying, "Give me something for lagniappe." The shopman always responds, gives the child a bit of licorice root, gives the servant a cheap cigar or a spool of thread, gives the governor, I don't know what he gives the governor, support, likely. When you're invited to drink, and this does occur now and then in New Orleans, and you say, "What, again?" "No, I've had enough." The other party says, "But just this one time more. This is for lagniappe." When the beau perceives that he is stacking his compliments a trifle too high, and sees by the young lady's countenance that the edifice would have been better with the top compliment left off, he puts his "I beg pardon, no harm intended" into the briefer form of, "Oh, that's for lagniappe." If the waiter in the restaurant stumbles and spills coffee down the back of your neck, he says, "For lagniappe, sir," and gets you another cup without extra charge. Chapter 45. Southern Sports. In the North, one hears the war mentioned, in social conversation, once a month, sometimes as often as once a week.
but as a distinct subject for talk it has long ago been relieved of duty. There are sufficient reasons for this. Given a dinner company of 6 gentlemen today, it can easily happen that 4 of them, and possibly 5, were not in the field at all, so the chances are 4 to 2 or 5 to 1 that the war will at no time during the evening become the topic of conversation. And the chances are still greater that if it becomes the topic, it will remain so but a little while. If you add 6 ladies to the company, you've added 6 people who saw so little of the dread realities of the war that they ran out of talk concerning them years ago, and now would soon weary of the war topic if you brought it up. The case is very different in the South. There, every man you meet was in the war, and every lady you meet saw the war. The war is the great chief topic of conversation. The interest in it is vivid and constant. The interest in other topics is fleeting. Mention of the war will wake up a dull company and set their tongues going when nearly any other topic would fail. In the South, the war is what A.D. is elsewhere. They date from it. All day long you hear things placed as having happened since the war, or during the war, or before the war, or right after the war, or about 2 years, or 5 years, or 10 years before the war, or after the war. It shows how intimately every individual was visited in his own person by that tremendous episode. It gives the inexperienced stranger a better idea of what a vast and comprehensive calamity invasion is than he can ever get by reading books at the fireside. At a club one evening, a gentleman turned to me and said, in an aside, "You notice, of course, that we are nearly always talking about the war. It isn't because we haven't anything else to talk about, but because nothing else has so strong an interest for us. And there's another reason. In the war, each of us, in his own person, seems to have sampled all the different varieties of human experience. As a consequence, you can't mention an outside matter of any sort, but it will certainly remind some listener of something that happened during the war, and out he comes with it. Of course, that brings the talk back to the war. You may try all you want to keep other subjects before the house, and we may all join in and help, but there can be but one result. The most random topic would load every man up with war reminiscences, and shut him up, too. And talk would be likely to stop presently, because you can't talk pale inconsequentialities when you've got a crimson fact or fancy in your head that you're burning to fetch out. The poet was sitting some distance away, and presently he began to speak about the moon. The gentleman who had been talking to me remarked in an aside, "There, the moon is far enough from the seat of war, but you will see that it will suggest something to somebody about the war. In 10 minutes from now, the moon as a topic will be shelved." The poet was saying he had noticed something which was a surprise to him, had the impression that down here, toward the equator, the moonlight was much stronger and brighter than up north, had the impression that when he visited New Orleans many years ago, the moon— Interruption from the other end of the room. "Let me explain that. Reminds me of an anecdote. Everything has changed since the war, for better or for worse, but you'll find people down here born grumblers who see no change except the change for the worse. There was an old Negro woman of this sort. A young New Yorker said in her presence, 'What a wonderful moon you have down here.' She sighed and said, 'Oh, bless your heart, honey, you ought to see that moon before the war.'" The new topic was dead already, but the poet resurrected it and gave it a new start. A brief dispute followed as to whether the difference between northern and southern moonlight really existed or was only imagined. Moonlight talk drifted easily into talk about artificial methods of dispelling darkness. Then somebody remembered that when Farragut advanced upon Port Hudson on a dark night, and did not wish to assist the aim of the Confederate gunners, he carried no battle lanterns, but painted the decks of his ships white, and thus created a dim but valuable light, which enabled his own men to grope their way around with considerable facility. At this point, the war got the floor again, and 10 minutes not quite up yet. I was not sorry, for war talk by men who have been in a war is always interesting, whereas moon talk by a poet who has not been in the moon is likely to be dull. We went to a cockpit in New Orleans on Saturday afternoon. I'd never seen a cockfight before. There were men and boys there of all ages and all colors, and of many languages and nationalities. But I noticed one quite conspicuous and surprising absence: the traditional brutal faces. There were no brutal faces. With no cockfighting going on, you could have played the gathering on a stranger for a prayer meeting, and after it began, for a revival, provided you blindfolded your stranger. The shouting was something prodigious. A Negro and a white man were in the ring, everybody else outside. The cocks were brought in sacks, and when time was called they were taken out by the two bottle holders, stroked, caressed, poked toward each other, and finally liberated. The big black cock plunged instantly at the little gray one and struck him on the head with his spur. The gray responded with spirit. Then the babel of many-tongued shoutings broke out and ceased not thenceforth. When the cocks had been fighting some little time, I was expecting them momently to drop dead, for both were blind, red with blood, and so exhausted that they frequently fell down. Yet they would not give up, neither would they die. The Negro and the white man would pick them up every few seconds, wipe them off, blow cold water on them in a fine spray, and take their heads into their mouths and hold them there a moment. To warm back the perishing life, perhaps, I do not know. Then, being set down again, the dying creatures would totter gropingly about, with dragging wings, find each other, strike a guesswork blow or two, and fall exhausted once more. I did not see the end of the battle. I forced myself to endure it as long as I could, but it was too pitiful a sight. So I made frank confession to that effect, and we retired. We heard afterward that the black cock died in the ring, fighting to the last. Evidently, there is abundant fascination about this sport for such as have had a degree of familiarity with it. I never saw people enjoy anything more than this gathering enjoyed this fight. The case was the same with old gray heads and with boys of 10. They lost themselves in frenzies of delight. The cocking main is an inhuman sort of entertainment, there's no question about that. Still, it seems a much more respectable and far less cruel sport than fox hunting, for the cocks like it. They experience as well as confer enjoyment, which is not the fox's case. We assisted, in the French sense, at a mule race one day. I believe I enjoyed this contest more than any other mule there. I enjoyed it more than I remember having enjoyed any other animal race I ever saw. The grandstand was well filled with the beauty and the chivalry of New Orleans. That phrase is not original with me. It is the Southern reporter's. He has used it for 2 generations. He uses it 20 times a day, or 20,000 times a day, or 1,000,000 times a day, according to the exigencies. He is obliged to use it 1,000,000 times a day if he have occasion to speak of respectable men and women that often, for he has no other phrase for such service except that single one. He never tires of it. It always has a fine sound to him. There's a kind of swell medieval bulliness and tinsel about it that pleases his gaudy, barbaric soul. If he'd been in Palestine in the early times, we should have had no references to much people out of him. No, he would have said, the beauty and the chivalry of Galilee assembled to hear the Sermon on the Mount. It is likely that the men and women of the South are sick enough of that phrase by this time and would change, but there's no immediate prospect of their getting it. The New Orleans editor has a strong, compact, direct, unflowery style, wastes no words, and does not gush. Not so with his average correspondent. In the appendix, I have quoted a good letter penned by a trained hand, but the average correspondent hurls a style which differs from that. For instance, the Times Democrat sent a relief steamer up one of the bayous last April.
This steamer landed at a village up there somewhere, and the captain invited some of the ladies of the village to make a short trip with him. They accepted and came aboard, and the steamboat shoved out up the creek. That was all there was to it. And that is all that the editor of the Times-Democrat would have got out of it. There was nothing in the thing but statistics, and he would have got nothing else out of it. He would probably have even tabulated them, partly to secure perfect clearness of statement and partly to save space. But his special correspondent knows other methods of handling statistics. He just throws off all restraint and wallows in them. On Saturday, early in the morning, the beauty of the place graced our cabin, and proud of her fair freight, the gallant little boat glided up the bayou. 22 words to say the ladies came aboard and the boat shoved out up the creek is a clean waste of 10 good words, and is also destructive of compactness of statement. The trouble with the Southern reporter is women. They unsettle him. They throw him off his balance. He's plain and sensible and satisfactory until woman heaves in sight. Then he goes all to pieces. His mind totters, becomes flowery and idiotic. From reading the above extract, you would imagine that this student of Sir Walter Scott is an apprentice, and knows next to nothing about handling a pen. On the contrary, he furnishes plenty of proofs in his long letter that he knows well enough how to handle it when the women are not around to give him the artificial flower complaint. For instance, at 4 o'clock, ominous clouds began to gather in the southeast, and presently from the Gulf there came a blow which increased in severity every moment. It was not safe to leave the landing then, and there was a delay. The oaks shook off long tresses of their mossy beards to the tugging of the wind, and the bayou, in its ambition, put on miniature waves in mocking of much larger bodies of water. A lull permitted a start, and homeward we steamed, an inky sky overhead, and a heavy wind blowing. As darkness crept on, there were few on board who did not wish themselves nearer home. There's nothing the matter with that. It's good description, compactly put. Yet there was great temptation there to drop into lurid writing. But let us return to the mule. Since I left him, I have rummaged around and found a full report of the race. In it I find confirmation of the theory which I broached just now, namely, that the trouble with the Southern reporter is women. Women, supplemented by Walter Scott and his knights and beauty and chivalry and so on. This is an excellent report, as long as the women stay out of it. But when they intrude, we have this frantic result. It will be probably a long time before the ladies' stand presents such a sea of foam-like loveliness as it did yesterday. The New Orleans women are always charming, but never so much so as at this time of year, when in their dainty spring costumes they bring with them a breath of balmy freshness and an odor of sanctity unspeakable. The stand was so crowded with them that, walking at their feet and seeing no possibility of approach, many a man appreciated as he never did before the Perry's feeling at the gates of paradise, and wondered what was the priceless boon that would admit him to their sacred presence. Sparkling on their white-robed breasts or shoulders were the colors of their favorite knights, and were it not for the fact that the doughty heroes appeared on unromantic mules, it would have been easy to imagine one of King Arthur's gala days. There were 13 miles in the first heat. All sorts of mules they were, all sorts of complexions, gaits, dispositions, aspects. Some were handsome creatures, some were not. Some were sleek, some hadn't had their fur brushed lately. Some were innocently gay and frisky, some were full of malice and all unrighteousness. Guessing from looks, some of them thought the matter on hand was war. Some thought it was a lark, and the rest took it for a religious occasion. And each mule acted according to his convictions. The result was an absence of harmony well compensated by a conspicuous presence of variety of a picturesque and entertaining sort. All the riders were young gentlemen in fashionable society. If the reader has been wondering why it is that the ladies of New Orleans attend so humble an orgy as a mule race, the thing is explained now. It is a fashion freak. All connected with it are people of fashion. It is great fun and cordially liked. The mule race is one of the marked occasions of the year. It has brought some pretty fast mules to the front. One of these had to be ruled out because he was so fast that he turned the thing into a one-mule contest and robbed it of one of its best features, variety. But every now and then somebody disguises him with a new name and a new complexion and rings him in again. The riders dress in full jockey costumes of bright-colored silks, satins, and velvets. The 13 mules got away in a body after a couple of false starts and scampered off with prodigious spirit. As each mule and each rider had a distinct opinion of his own as to how the race ought to be run, and which side of the track was best in certain circumstances, and how often the track ought to be crossed, and when a collision ought to be accomplished and when it ought to be avoided, these 26 conflicting opinions created a most fantastic and picturesque confusion, and the resulting spectacle was killingly comical. Mile heat. Time, 2 minutes 22 seconds. 8 of the 13 mules distanced. I had a bet on a mule which would have won if the procession had been reversed. The second heat was good fun, and so was the consolation race for beaten mules, which followed later. But the first heat was the best in that respect. I think that much the most enjoyable of all races is a steamboat race. But next to that, I prefer the gay and joyous mule rush. 2 red-hot steamboats raging along neck and neck, straining every nerve, that is to say, every rivet in the boilers, quaking and shaking and groaning from stem to stern, spouting white steam from the pipes, pouring black smoke from the chimneys, raining down sparks, parting the river into long breaks of hissing foam. This is sport that makes a body's very liver curl with enjoyment. A horse race is pretty tame and colorless in comparison. Still, a horse race might be well enough in its way, perhaps, if it were not for the tiresome false starts. But then, nobody is ever killed. At least, nobody was ever killed when I was at a horse race. They have been crippled, it is true, but this is little to the purpose.
This ends Disc 9, Life on the Mississippi, Disc 10.
Chapter 46. Enchantments and Enchanters. The largest annual event in New Orleans is a something which we arrived too late to sample, the Mardi Gras festivities. I saw the procession of the mystic crew of Comus there 24 years ago, with knights and nobles and so on, clothed in silken and golden Paris-made gorgeousness, planned and bought for that single night's use, and in their train all manner of giants, dwarfs, monstrosities, and other diverting grotesquerie, a startling and wonderful sort of show, as it filed solemnly and silently down the street in the light of its smoking and flickering torches. But it's said that in these latter days the spectacle is mightily augmented as to cost, splendor, and variety. There is a chief personage, Rex, and if I remember rightly, neither this king nor any of his great following of subordinates is known to any outsider. All these people are gentlemen of position and consequence, and it is a proud thing to belong to the organization. So the mystery in which they hide their personality is merely for romance's sake, and not on account of the police. Mardi Gras is, of course, a relic of the French and Spanish occupation, but I judge that the religious feature has been pretty well knocked out of it now. Sir Walter has got the advantage of the gentleman of the cowl and rosary, and he will stay. His medieval business, supplemented by the monsters and the oddities and the pleasant creatures from fairyland, is finer to look at than the poor fantastic inventions and performances of the reveling rabble of the priest's day, and serves quite as well, perhaps, to emphasize the day and admonish men that the grace line between the worldly season and the holy one is reached. This Mardi Gras pageant was the exclusive possession of New Orleans until recently, but now it has spread to Memphis and St. Louis and Baltimore. It has probably reached its limit. It's a thing which could hardly exist in the practical North, would certainly last but a very brief time, as brief a time as it would last in London, for the soul of it is the romantic, not the funny and the grotesque. Take away the romantic mysteries, the kings and knights and big-sounding titles, and Mardi Gras would die down there in the South. The very feature that keeps it alive in the South, girly-girly romance, would kill it in the North or in London. Puck and Punch and the press universal would fall upon it and make merciless fun of it, and its first exhibition would also be its last. Against the crimes of the French Revolution and of Bonaparte may be set two compensating benefactions. The Revolution broke the chains of the Ancien Regime and of the Church, and made a nation of abject slaves a nation of free men. And Bonaparte instituted the setting of merit above birth, and also so completely stripped the divinity from royalty that, whereas crowned heads in Europe were gods before, they are only men since, and can never be gods again, but only figureheads, and answerable for their acts like common clay. Such benefactions as these compensate the temporary harm which Bonaparte and the Revolution did, and leave the world in debt to them for these great and permanent services to liberty, humanity, and progress. Then comes Sir Walter Scott with his enchantment, and by his single might checks this wave of progress, and even turns it back, sets the world in love with dreams and phantoms, with decayed and swinish forms of religion, with decayed and degraded systems of government, with the sillinesses and emptiness, sham grandeurs, sham gods, and sham chivalries of a brainless and worthless, long-vanished society. He did measureless harm, more real and lasting harm, perhaps, than any other individual that ever wrote. Most of the world has now outlived a good part of these harms, though by no means all of them. But in our South they flourish pretty forcefully still. Not so forcefully as half a generation ago, perhaps, but still forcefully. There, the genuine and wholesome civilization of the 19th century is curiously confused and commingled with the Walter Scott middle-age sham civilization. And so you have practical common sense, progressive ideas, and progressive works mixed up with the duel, the inflated speech, and the jejune romanticism of an absurd past that is dead and out of charity ought to be buried. But for the Sir Walter disease, the character of the Southerner, or Southron, according to Sir Walter's starchier way of phrasing it, would be wholly modern, in place of modern and medieval mixed, and the South would be fully a generation further advanced than it is. It was Sir Walter that made every gentleman in the South a major or a colonel or a general or a judge before the war, and it was he also that made these gentlemen value these bogus decorations. For it was he that created rank and caste down here, and also reverence for rank and caste, and pride and pleasure in them. Enough is laid on slavery without fathering upon it these creations and contributions of Sir Walter. Sir Walter had so large a hand in making Southern character, as it existed before the war, that he is in great measure responsible for the war. It seems a little harsh toward a dead man to say that we never should have had any war but for Sir Walter, and yet something of a plausible argument might perhaps be made in support of that wild proposition. The Southerner of the American Revolution owned slaves. So did the Southerner of the Civil War. But the former resembles the latter as an Englishman resembles a Frenchman. The change of character can be traced rather more easily to Sir Walter's influence than to that of any other thing or person. One may observe by one or two signs how deeply that influence penetrated and how strongly it holds. If one take up a northern or southern literary periodical of 40 or 50 years ago, he will find it filled with wordy, windy, flowery eloquence, romanticism, sentimentality, all imitated from Sir Walter, and sufficiently badly done, too. Innocent travesties of his style and methods, in fact. This sort of literature being the fashion in both sections of the country, there was opportunity for the fairest competition, and as a consequence, the South was able to show as many well-known literary names, apportioned to population, as the North could. But a change has come, and there is no opportunity now for a fair competition between North and South. For the North has thrown out that old inflated style, whereas the Southern writer still clings to it, and has a restricted market for his wares as a consequence. There is as much literary talent in the South now as ever there was, of course, but its work can gain but slight currency under present conditions. The authors write for the past, not for the present. They use obsolete forms and a dead language. But when a Southerner of genius writes modern English, his book goes upon crutches no longer, but upon wings, and they carry it swiftly all about America and England, and through the great English reprint publishing houses of Germany, as witness the experience of Mr. Cable and Uncle Remus, two of the very few Southern authors who do not write in the Southern style. Instead of 3 or 4 widely known literary names, the South ought to have a dozen or two, and will have them when Sir Walter's time is out. A curious exemplification of the power of a single book for good or harm is shown in the effects wrought by Don Quixote and those wrought by Ivanhoe. The first swept the world's admiration for the medieval chivalry silliness out of existence, and the other restored it. As far as our South is concerned, the good work done by Cervantes is pretty nearly a dead letter, so effectually has Scott's pernicious work undermined it. Chapter 47. Uncle Remus and Mr. Cable. Mr. Joel Chandler Harris, Uncle Remus, was to arrive from Atlanta at 7 o'clock Sunday morning, so we got up and received him. We were able to detect him among the crowd of arrivals at the hotel counter by his correspondence with a description of him which had been furnished us from a trustworthy source. He was said to be undersized, red-haired, and somewhat freckled. He was the only man in the party whose outside tallied with this bill of particulars. He was said to be very shy. He is a shy man. Of this there is no doubt. It may not show on the surface, but the shyness is there. After days of intimacy, one wonders to see that it is still in about as strong force as ever. There is a fine and beautiful nature hidden behind it, as all know who have read the Uncle Remus book, and a fine genius, too, as all know by the same sign. I seem to be talking quite freely about this neighbor, but in talking to the public, I am but talking to his personal friends, and these things are permissible among friends. He deeply disappointed a number of children, who had flocked eagerly to Mr. Cable's house to get a glimpse of the illustrious sage and oracle of the nation's nurseries. They said, "Why is white?" They were grieved about it. So, to console them, the book was brought, that they might hear Uncle Remus's tar-baby story from the lips of Uncle Remus himself, or what in their outraged eyes was left of him. But it turned out that he had never read aloud to people and was too shy to venture the attempt now. Mr. Cable and I read from books of ours to show him what an easy trick it was. But his immortal shyness was proof against even this sagacious strategy, so we had to read about Brer Rabbit ourselves. Mr. Harris ought to be able to read the Negro dialect better than anybody else, for in the manner of writing it, he is the only master the country has produced. Mr. Cable is the only master in the writing of French dialects that the country has produced, and he reads them in perfection. It was a great treat to hear him read about Gina Poquelin, and about Innerarity and his famous picture representing Louisiana refusing to enter the Union, along with passages of nicely shaded German dialect from a novel which was still in manuscript. It came out in conversation that in 2 different instances Mr. Cable got into grotesque trouble by using in his books next to impossible French names, which nevertheless happen to be borne by living and sensitive citizens of New Orleans. His names were either inventions or were borrowed from the ancient and obsolete past. I do not now remember which, but at any rate, living bearers of them turned up, and were a good deal hurt at having attention directed to themselves and their affairs in so excessively public a manner. Mr. Warner and I had an experience of the same sort when we wrote the book called The Gilded Age. There's a character in it called Sellers. I do not remember what his first name was in the beginning, but anyway, Mr. Warner did not like it and wanted it improved. He asked me if I was able to imagine a person named Eskel Sellers. Of course, I said I could not, without stimulants. He said the way out west once he had met and contemplated and actually shaken hands with a man bearing that impossible name, Eskel Sellers. He added, "It was 20 years ago. His name has probably carried him off before this, and if it hasn't, he'll never see the book anyhow. We'll confiscate his name. The name you're using is common and therefore dangerous. There are probably 1,000 Sellerses bearing it, and the whole horde'll come after us. But Eskel Sellers is a safe name. It's a rock." So we borrowed that name. And when the book had been out about a week, one of the stateliest and handsomest and most aristocratic-looking white men that ever lived called around with the most formidable libel suit in his pocket that ever— well, in brief, we got his permission to suppress an edition of 10 million copies of the book and change that name to Berea Sellers in future editions. The figures are taken from memory and probably incorrect. I think it was more. Chapter 48. Sugar and Postage. One day on the street, I encountered the man whom, of all men, I most wished to see, Horace Bixby, formerly pilot under me, or rather over me, now captain of the great steamer City of Baton Rouge, the latest and swiftest addition to the anchor line. The same slender figure, the same tight curls, the same spring step, the same alertness, the same decision of eye and answering decision of hand, the same erect military bearing. Not an inch gained or lost in girth, not an ounce gained or lost in weight, nor a hair turned. It's a curious thing to leave a man 35 years old and come back at the end of 21 years and find him still only 35. I've not had an experience of this kind before, I believe. There were some crow's feet, but they counted for next to nothing, since they were inconspicuous. His boat was just in. I'd been waiting several days for her, purposing to return to St. Louis in her. The captain and I joined a party of ladies and gentlemen, guests of Major Wood, and went down the river 54 miles in a swift tug to ex-Governor Warmouth's sugar plantation. Strung along below the city was a number of decayed, ramshackly superannuated old steamboats, not one of which had I ever seen before. They'd all been built and worn out and thrown aside since I was here last. This gives one a realizing sense of the frailness of a Mississippi boat and the briefness of its life. 6 miles below town, a fat and battered brick chimney sticking above the magnolias and live oaks was pointed out as the monument erected by an appreciative nation to celebrate the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson's victory over the British, January 8, 1815. The war had ended. The two nations were at peace, but the news had not yet reached New Orleans. If we had had the cable telegraph in those days, this blood would not have been spilt, those lives would not have been wasted, and better still, Jackson would probably never have been president. We've gotten over the harms done us by the War of 1812, but not over some of those done us by Jackson's presidency. The Warmouth plantation covers a vast deal of ground, and the hospitality of the Warmouth mansion is graduated to the same large scale. We saw steam plows at work here for the first time. The traction engine travels about on its own wheels till it reaches the required spot. Then it stands still, and by means of a wire rope pulls the huge plow toward itself 200 or 300 yards across the field between the rows of cane. The thing cuts down into the black mold 1.5 feet deep. The plow looks like a fore and aft brace of a Hudson River steamer, inverted. When the Negro steersman sits on one end of it, that end tilts down near the ground while the other sticks up high in the air. This great seesaw goes rolling and pitching like a ship at sea, and it's not every circus rider that could stay on it. The plantation contains 2,600 acres. 650 are in cane, and there is a fruitful orange grove of 5,000 trees. The cane is cultivated after a modern and intricate scientific fashion, too elaborate and complex for me to attempt to describe. But it lost $40,000 last year. I forget the other details. However, this year's crop will reach 10 or 1,200 tons of sugar. Consequently, last year's loss will not matter. These troublesome and expensive scientific methods achieve a yield of 1.5 tons, and from that to 2 tons to the acre, which is 3 or 4 times what the yield of an acre was in my time. The drainage ditches were everywhere alive with little crabs, fiddlers. One saw them scampering sideways in every direction whenever they heard a disturbing noise. Expensive pests, these crabs, for they bore into the levees and ruin them. The great sugar house was a wilderness of tubs and tanks and vats and filters, pumps, pipes, and machinery. The process of making sugar is exceedingly interesting. First, you heave your cane into the centrifugals and grind out the juice. Then run it through the evaporating pan to extract the fiber. Then through the bone filter to remove the alcohol. Then through the clarifying tanks to discharge the molasses, then through the granulating pipe to condense it, then through the vacuum pan to extract the vacuum. It's now ready for market. I have jotted these particulars down from memory. The thing looks simple and easy. Do not deceive yourself. To make sugar is really one of the most difficult things in the world, and to make it right is next to impossible. If you will examine your own supply every now and then for a term of years, and tabulate the result, you will find that not 2 men in 20 can make sugar without getting sand into it. We could have gone down to the mouth of the river and visited Captain Eads' great work, the jetties, where the river has been compressed between walls and thus deepened to 26 feet. But it was voted useless to go, since at this stage of the water everything would be covered up and invisible. We could have visited that ancient and singular burg, Pilot Town, which stands on stilts in the water, so they say, where nearly all communication is by skiff and canoe, even to the attending of weddings and funerals, and where the littlest boys and girls are as handy with the oar as unamphibious children are with the velocipede. We could have done a number of other things, but on account of limited time we went back home. The sail up the breezy and sparkling river was a charming experience, and would have been satisfyingly sentimental and romantic but for the interruptions of the tug's pet parrot, whose tireless comments upon the scenery and guests were always this-worldly and often profane. He had also a superabundance of the discordant, ear-splitting metallic laugh common to his breed, a machine-made laugh, a Frankenstein laugh, with the soul left out of it. He applied it to every sentimental remark, and to every pathetic song. He cackled it out with hideous energy after home again from the foreign shore, and, said he, wouldn't give a damn for a tugload of such rot. Romance and sentiment cannot long survive this sort of discouragement. So the singing and talking presently ceased, which so delighted the parrot that he cursed himself hoarse for joy. Then the male members of the party moved to the forecastle to smoke and gossip. There were several old steamboatmen along, and I learned from them a great deal of what had been happening to my former river friends during my long absence. I learned that a pilot whom I used to steer for is become a spiritualist, and for more than 15 years has been receiving a letter every week from a deceased relative through a New York spiritualistic medium named Manchester, Postage graduated by distance. From the local post office in Paradise to New York, $5. From New York to St. Louis, 3 cents. I remember Mr. Manchester very well. I called on him once, 10 years ago, with a couple of friends, one of whom wished to inquire after a deceased uncle. This uncle had lost his life in a peculiarly violent and unusual way 6 years before. A cyclone blew him some 3 miles and knocked a tree down with him, which was 4 feet through at the butt and 65 feet high. He did not survive this triumph. At the séance just referred to, my friend questioned his late uncle through Mr. Manchester, and the late uncle wrote down his replies, using Mr. Manchester's hand and pencil for that purpose. The following is a fair example of the questions asked, and also of the sloppy twaddle in the way of answers furnished by Mr. Manchester under the pretense that it came from the spectre. If this man is not the paltriest fraud that lives, I owe him an apology. Question: where are you? Answer: in the spirit world. Are you happy? Very happy, perfectly happy. How do you amuse yourself? Conversation with friends and other spirits. What else? Nothing else. Nothing else is necessary. What do you talk about? About how happy we are, and about friends left behind in the earth, and how to influence them for their good. When your friends in the earth all get to the spirit land, what shall you have to talk about then? Nothing but about how happy you all are? No reply. It is explained that spirits will not answer frivolous questions. How is it that spirits that are content to spend an eternity in frivolous employments and accept it as happiness are so fastidious about frivolous questions upon the subject? No reply. Would you like to come back? No. Would you say that under oath? Yes. What do you eat there? We do not eat. What do you drink? We do not drink. What do you smoke? We do not smoke. What do you read? We do not read. Do all the good people go to your place? Yes. You know my present way of life. Can you suggest any additions to it in the way of crime that will reasonably ensure my going to some other place? No reply. When did you die? I did not die. I passed away. Very well, then. When did you pass away? How long have you been in the spirit land? We have no measurements of time here. Though you may be indifferent and uncertain as to dates and times in your present condition and environment, this has nothing to do with your former condition. You had dates then. One of these is what I asked for. You departed on a certain day in a certain year. Is not this true? Yes. Then name the day of the month. Much fumbling with the pencil on the part of the medium, accompanied by violent spasmodic jerkings of his head and body for some little time. Finally, explanation to the effect that spirits often forget dates, such things being without importance to them. Then this one has actually forgotten the date of its translation to the spirit land? This was granted to be the case. This is very curious. Well then, what year was it? More fumbling, jerking, idiotic spasms on the part of the medium. Finally, explanation to the effect that the spirit has forgotten the year. This is indeed stupendous. Let me put one more question, one last question to you before we part to meet no more. For even if I fail to avoid your asylum, a meeting there will go for nothing as a meeting, since by that time you will easily have forgotten me and my name. Did you die a natural death, or were you cut off by a catastrophe? After a long hesitation and many throes and spasms, natural death. This ended the interview. My friend told the medium that when his relative was in this poor world, he was endowed with an extraordinary intellect and an absolutely defectless memory, and it seemed a great pity that he had not been allowed to keep some shred of these for his amusement in the realms of everlasting contentment, and for the amazement and admiration of the rest of the population there. This man had plenty of clients, has plenty yet. He receives letters from spirits located in every part of the spirit world, and delivers them all over this country through the United States mail. These letters are filled with advice. Advice from spirits who don't know as much as a tadpole. And this advice is religiously followed by the receivers. One of these clients was a man whom the spirits, if one may thus plurally describe the ingenious Manchester, were teaching how to contrive an improved railway car wheel. It is coarse employment for a spirit, but it is higher and wholesomer activity than talking forever about how happy we are. Chapter 49. Episodes in Pilot Life. In the course of the tugboat gossip, it came out that out of every 5 of my former friends who had quitted the river, 4 had chosen farming as an occupation. Of course, this was not because they were peculiarly gifted agriculturally, and thus more likely to succeed as farmer than in other industries. The reason for their choice must be traced to some other source. Doubtless, they chose farming because that life is private and secluded from eruptions of undesirable strangers, like the pilot-house hermitage. And doubtless they also chose it because, on 1,000 nights of black storm and danger, they had noted the twinkling lights of solitary farmhouses as the boat swung by, and pictured to themselves the serenity and security and coziness of such refuges at such times, and so had by and by come to dream of that retired and peaceful life as the one desirable thing to long for, anticipate, earn, and at last enjoy. But I didn't learn that any of these pilot farmers had astonished anybody with their successes. Their farms do not support them. They support their farms. The pilot farmer disappears from the river annually, about the breaking of spring, and is seen no more till next frost. Then he appears again, in damaged homespun, combs the hayseed out of his hair, and takes a pilot-house berth for the winter. In this way, he pays the debts which his farming has achieved during the agricultural season. So his river bondage is but half broken. He's still the river's slave the hardest half of the year. One of these men bought a farm, but did not retire to it. He knew a trick worth 2 of that. He didn't propose to pauperize his farm by applying his personal ignorance to working it. No, he put the farm into the hands of an agricultural expert to be worked on shares. Out of every 3 loads of corn, the expert to have 2 and the pilot the 3rd. But at the end of the season, the pilot received no corn. The expert explained that his share was not reached. The farm produced only 2 loads. Some of the pilots, whom I had known, had had adventures, the outcome fortunate sometimes, but not in all cases. Captain Montgomery, whom I had steered for when he was a pilot, commanded the Confederate fleet in the great battle before Memphis. When his vessel went down, he swam ashore, fought his way through a squad of soldiers, and made a gallant and narrow escape. He was always a cool man. Nothing could disturb his serenity. Once, when he was captain of the Crescent City, I was bringing the boat into port at New Orleans, and momently expecting orders from the hurricane deck, but received none. I'd stopped the wheels, and there my authority and responsibility ceased. It was evening, dim twilight. The captain's hat was perched upon the big bell, and I supposed the intellectual end of the captain was in it. But such was not the case. The captain was very strict. Therefore I knew better than to touch a bell without orders. My duty was to hold the boat steadily on the calamitous course and leave the consequences to take care of themselves, which I did. So we went plowing past the sterns of steamboats and getting closer and closer. The crash was bound to come very soon, and still that hat never budged, for, alas, the captain was napping in the Texas. Things were becoming exceedingly nervous and uncomfortable. It seemed to me that the captain was not going to appear in time to see the entertainment. But he did. Just as we were walking into the stern of a steamboat, he stepped out on deck and said, with heavenly serenity, "Set her back on both," which I did, but a trifle late, however, for the next moment we went smashing through the other boat's flimsy outer works with a most prodigious racket. The captain never said a word to me about the matter afterward, except to remark that I had done right, and that he hoped I would not hesitate to act in the same way again in like circumstances. One of the pilots, whom I had known when I was on the river, had died a very honorable death. His boat caught fire, and he remained at the wheel until he got her safe to land. Then he went out over the breastboard with his clothing in flames, and was the last person to get ashore. He died from his injuries in the course of 2 or 3 hours, and his was the only life lost. The history of Mississippi piloting affords 6 or 7 instances of this sort of martyrdom, and half a hundred instances of escape from a like fate, which came within a second or two of being fatally too late. But there is no instance of a pilot deserting his post to save his life, while, by remaining and sacrificing it, he might secure other lives from destruction. It's well worth while to set down this noble fact, and well worth while to put it in italics, too. The cub pilot is early admonished to despise all perils connected with a pilot's calling, and to prefer any sort of death to the deep dishonor of deserting his post while there's any possibility of his being useful in it. And so effectively are these admonitions inculcated that even young and but half-tried pilots can be depended upon to stick to the wheel and die there when occasion requires. In a Memphis graveyard is buried a young fellow who perished at the wheel a great many years ago in White River to save the lives of other men. He said to the captain that if the fire would give him time to reach a sandbar some distance away, all could be saved, but that to land against the bluff bank of the river would be to ensure the loss of many lives. He reached the bar and grounded the boat in shallow water, but by that time the flames had closed in around him, and in escaping through them he was fatally burned. He'd been urged to fly sooner, but had replied, as became a pilot to reply, "I will not go. If I go, nobody will be saved. If I stay, no one will be lost but me. I will stay." There were 200 persons on board, and no life was lost but the pilot's. There used to be a monument to this young fellow in that Memphis graveyard. While we tarried in Memphis on our down trip, I started out to look for it, but our time was so brief that I was obliged to turn back before my object was accomplished. The tugboat gossip informed me that Dick Kennett was dead, blown up near Memphis and killed, that several others whom I had known had fallen in the war, 1 or 2 of them shot down at the wheel, that another and very particular friend, whom I had steered many trips for, had stepped out of his house in New Orleans one night years ago to collect some money in a remote part of the city, and had never been seen again, was murdered and thrown into the river, it was thought, that Ben Thornburg was dead long ago, also his wild cub, whom I used to quarrel with all through every daylight watch. A heedless, reckless creature he was, and always in hot water, always in mischief. An Arkansas passenger brought an enormous bear aboard one day and chained him to a lifeboat on the hurricane deck. Thornburg's cub could not rest till he had gone there and unchained the bear to see what he would do. He was promptly gratified. The bear chased him around and around the deck for miles and miles, with 200 eager faces grinning through the railings for audience, and finally snatched off the lad's coat tail and went into the Texas to chew it. The off-watch turned out with alacrity and left the bear in sole possession. He presently grew lonesome and started out for recreation. He ranged the whole boat, visited every part of it, with an advance guard of fleeing people in front of him and a voiceless vacancy behind him. And when his owner captured him at last, those 2 were the only visible beings anywhere. Everybody else was in hiding, and the boat was a solitude. I was told that one of my pilot friends fell dead at the wheel from heart disease in 1869. The captain was on the roof at the time. He saw the boat breaking for the shore, shouted and got no answer, ran up and found the pilot lying dead on the floor. Mr. Bixby had been blown up in Madrid Bend, was not injured, but the other pilot was lost. George Ritchie had been blown up near Memphis, blown into the river from the wheel and disabled. The water was very cold. He clung to a cotton bale, mainly with his teeth, and floated until nearly exhausted, when he was rescued by some deckhands who were on a piece of the wreck. They tore open the bale and packed him into the cotton and warmed the life back into him and got him safe to Memphis. He's one of Bixby's pilots on the Baton Rouge now. Into the life of a steamboat clerk, now dead, had dropped a bit of romance. Somewhat grotesque romance, but romance nevertheless. When I knew him, he was a shiftless young spendthrift, boisterous, good-hearted, full of careless generosities, and pretty conspicuously promising to fool his possibilities away early and come to nothing. In a western city lived a rich and childless old foreigner and his wife, and in their family was a comely young girl, sort of a friend, sort of a servant. The young clerk, of whom I've been speaking, whose name was not George Johnson, but who shall be called George Johnson for the purposes of this narrative, got acquainted with this young girl, and they sinned, and the old foreigner found them out and rebuked them. Being ashamed, they lied and said they were married, that they'd been privately married. Then the old foreigner's hurt was healed, and he forgave and blessed them. After that, they were able to continue their sin without concealment. By and by, the foreigner's wife died, and presently he followed after her. Friends of the family assembled to mourn, and among the mourners sat the two young sinners. The will was opened and solemnly read. It bequeathed every penny of that old man's great wealth to Mrs. George Johnson, and there was no such person. The young sinners fled forth then, and did a very foolish thing, married themselves before an obscure justice of the peace, and got him to antedate the thing. That did no sort of good. The distant relatives flocked in and exposed the fraudulent date with extreme suddenness and surprising ease, and carried off the fortune, leaving the Johnsons very legitimately and legally and irrevocably chained together in honorable marriage, but with not so much as a penny to bless themselves withal. Such are the actual facts, and not all novels have for a base so telling a situation. Chapter 50. The Original Jacobs. We had some talk about Captain Isaiah Sellers, now many years dead. He was a fine man, a high-minded man, and greatly respected both ashore and on the river. He was very tall, well-built, and handsome, and in his old age, as I remember him, his hair was as black as an Indian's, and his eye and hand were as strong and steady, and his nerve and judgment as firm and clear as anybody's, young or old, among the fraternity of pilots. He was the patriarch of the craft. He'd been a keelboat pilot before the day of steamboats, and a steamboat pilot before any other steamboat pilot, still surviving at the time I speak of, had ever turned a wheel. Consequently, his brethren held him in the sort of awe in which illustrious survivors of a bygone age are always held by their associates. He knew how he was regarded, and perhaps this fact added some trifle of stiffening to his natural dignity, which had been sufficiently stiff in its original state. He left a diary behind him, but apparently it did not date back to his first steamboat trip, which was said to be 1811, the year the first steamboat disturbed the waters of the Mississippi. At the time of his death, a correspondent of the St. Louis Republican culled the following items from the diary. In February 1825, he shipped on board the steamer Rambler at Florence, Alabama, and made, during that year, 3 trips to New Orleans and back, this on the General Carroll between Nashville and New Orleans. It was during his stay on this boat that Captain Sellers introduced the tap of the bell as a signal to heave the lead, previous to which time it was the custom for the pilot to speak to the men below when soundings were wanted. The proximity of the forecastle to the pilot-house, no doubt, rendered this an easy matter, but how different on one of our palaces of the present day. In 1827 we find him on board the President, a boat of 285 tons burden, and plying between Smithland and New Orleans. Thence he joined the Jubilee in 1828, and on this boat he did his first piloting in the St. Louis trade, his first watch extending from Herculaneum to St. Genevieve. On May 26, 1836, he completed and left Pittsburgh in charge of the steamer Prairie, a boat of 400 tons, and the first steamer with a stateroom cabin ever seen at St. Louis. In 1857, he introduced the signal for meeting boats, which has, with some slight change, been the universal custom of this day. In fact, is rendered obligatory by Act of Congress. As general items of river history, we quote the following marginal notes from his general log. In March 1825, General Lafayette left New Orleans for St. Louis on the low-pressure steamer Natchez. In January 1828, 21 steamers left the New Orleans wharf to celebrate the occasion of General Jackson's visit to that city. In 1830, the North American made the run from New Orleans to Memphis in 6 days, best time on record to that date. It has since been made in 2 days and 10 hours. In 1831, the Red River Cutoff formed. In 1832, steamer Hudson made the run from White River to Helena, a distance of 75 miles, in 12 hours. This was the source of much talk and speculation among the parties directly interested. In 1839, Great Horseshoe Cutoff formed. Up to the present time, a term of 35 years, we ascertain by reference to the diary he has made 460 round trips to New Orleans, which gives a distance of 1,104,000 miles, or an average of 86 miles a day. Whenever Captain Sellers approached a body of gossiping pilots, a chill fell there, and talking ceased. For this reason, whenever 6 pilots were gathered together, there would always be 1 or 2 newly fledged ones in the lot, and the elder ones would always be showing off before these poor fellows, making them sorrowfully feel how callow they were, how recent their nobility, and how humble their degree, by talking largely and vaporously of old-time experiences on the river, always making it a point to date everything back as far as they could, so as to make the new men feel their newness to the sharpest degree possible, and envy the old stagers in the like degree. And how these complacent bald heads would swell and brag and lie and date back 10, 15, 20 years, and how they did enjoy the effect produced upon the marveling and envying youngsters. And perhaps just at this happy stage of the proceedings, the stately figure of Captain Isaiah Sellers, that real and only genuine son of antiquity, would drift solemnly into the midst. Imagine the size of the silence that would result on the instant, and imagine the feelings of those bald heads, and the exultation of their recent audience, when the ancient captain would begin to drop casual and indifferent remarks of a reminiscent nature, about islands that had disappeared and cut-offs that had been made a generation before the oldest bald head in the company had ever set his foot in a pilot-house. Many and many a time did this ancient mariner appear on the scene in the above fashion, and spread disaster and humiliation around him. If one might believe the pilots, he always dated his islands back to the misty dawn of river history, and he never used the same island twice, and never did he employ an island that still existed, or give one a name which anybody present was old enough to have heard before. If you might believe the pilots, he was always conscientiously particular about little details. Never spoke of the state of Mississippi, for instance. No, he would say, when the state of Mississippi was where Arkansas now is, and would never speak of Louisiana or Missouri in a general way and leave an incorrect impression on your mind. No, he would say, when Louisiana was up the river farther, or when Missouri was on the Illinois side. The old gentleman was not of literary turn or capacity, but he used to jot down brief paragraphs of plain, practical information about the river, and sign them Mark Twain, and give them to the New Orleans Picayune. They related to the stage and condition of the river, and were accurate and valuable. And thus far they contained no poison. But in speaking of the stage of the river today at a given point, the captain was pretty apt to drop in a little remark about this being the first time he had seen the water so high or so low at that particular point in 49 years, and now and then he would mention island so-and-so, and follow it, in parenthesis, with some such observation as disappeared in 1807, if I remember rightly. In these antique interjections lay poison and bitterness for the other old pilots, and they used to chaff the Mark Twain paragraphs with unsparing mockery. It so chanced that one of these paragraphs became the text for my very first newspaper article. The original manuscript of it, in the captain's own hand, has been sent to me from New Orleans. It reads as follows. Vicksburg, May 4th, 1859. My opinion for the benefit of the citizens of New Orleans. The water is higher this far up than it has been since 1815. My opinion is that the water will be 4 feet deep in Canal Street before the 1st of next June. Mrs. Turner's plantation, at the head of Big Black Island, is all under water, and it has not been since 1815. I. Sellers. I burlesqued it broadly, very broadly, stringing my fantastics out to the extent of 800 or 1,000 words. I was a cub at the time. I showed my performance to some pilots, and they eagerly rushed it into print in the New Orleans True Delta. It was a great pity, for it did nobody any worthy service, and it sent a pang deep into a good man's heart. There was no malice in my rubbish, but it laughed at the captain. It laughed at a man to whom such a thing was new and strange and dreadful. I did not know then, though I do now. There is no suffering comparable with that which a private person feels when he is for the first time pilloried in print. Captain Sellers did me the honor to profoundly detest me from that day forth. When I say he did me the honor, I am not using empty words. It was a very real honor to be in the thoughts of so great a man as Captain Sellers, and I had wit enough to appreciate it and be proud of it. It was distinction to be loved by such a man, but it was a much greater distinction to be hated by him, because he loved scores of people. But he didn't sit up nights to hate anybody but me. He never printed another paragraph while he lived, and he never again signed Mark Twain to anything. At the time that the telegraph brought the news of his death, I was on the Pacific coast. I was a fresh, new journalist, and needed a nom de guerre, so I confiscated the ancient mariner's discarded one, and have done my best to make it remain what it was in his hands, a sign and symbol and warrant that whatever is found in its company may be gambled on as being the petrified truth. How I've succeeded it would not be modest in me to say. The captain had an honorable pride in his profession, and an abiding love for it. He ordered his monument before he died, and kept it near him until he did die. It stands over his grave now in Bellefontaine Cemetery, St. Louis. It is his image, in marble, standing on duty at the pilot wheel, and worthy to stand and confront criticism, for it represents a man who in life would have stayed there till he burned to a cinder if duty required it. The finest thing we saw on our whole Mississippi trip we saw as we approached New Orleans in the steam tug. This was the curving frontage of the Crescent City, lit up with the white glare of 5 miles of electric lights. It was a wonderful sight, and very beautiful. Chapter 51. Reminiscences. We left for St. Louis, in the city of Baton Rouge, on a delightfully hot day, but with the main purpose of my visit but lamely accomplished. I had hoped to hunt up and talk with 100 steamboatmen, but got so pleasantly involved in the social life of the town that I got nothing more than mere 5-minute talks with a couple of dozen of the craft. I was on the bench of the pilot-house when we backed out and straightened up for the start, the boat pausing for a good ready in the old-fashioned way, and the black smoke piling out of the chimneys equally in the old-fashioned way. Then we began to gather momentum, and presently were fairly under way and booming along. It was all as natural and familiar, and so were the shoreward sights, as if there'd been no break in my river life. There was a cub, and I judged that he would take the wheel now, and he did. Captain Bixby stepped into the pilot-house. Presently the cub closed up on the rank of steamships. He made me nervous, for he allowed too much water to show between our boat and the ship's. I knew quite well what was going to happen, because I could date back to my own life and inspect the record. The captain looked on during a silent half-minute, then took the wheel himself and crowded the boat in till she went scraping along within a hand-breadth of the ship's. It was exactly the favor which he had done me about a quarter of a century before, on that same spot, the first time I ever steamed out of the port of New Orleans. It was a very great and sincere pleasure to me to see the thing repeated, with somebody else as the victim. We made Natchez, 300 miles, in 22 hours and a half, much the swiftest passage I have ever made over that piece of water. The next morning, I came on with the 4 o'clock watch, and saw Ritchie successfully run half a dozen crossings in a fog, using for his guidance the marked chart devised and patented by Bixby himself. This sufficiently evidenced the great value of the chart. By and by, when the fog began to clear off, I noticed that the reflection of a tree in the smooth water of an overflowed bank 600 yards away was stronger and blacker than the ghostly tree itself. The faint, spectral trees, dimly glimpsed through the shredding fog, were very pretty things to see. We had a heavy thunderstorm at Natchez, another at Vicksburg, and still another about 50 miles below Memphis. They had an old-fashioned energy which had long been unfamiliar to me. This third storm was accompanied by a raging wind. We tied up to the bank when we saw the tempest coming, and everybody left the pilot-house but me. The wind bent the young trees down, exposing the pale underside of the leaves, and gust after gust followed in quick succession, thrashing the branches violently up and down, to this side and that, and creating swift waves of alternating green and white, according to the side of the leaf that was exposed. And these waves raced after each other, as do their kind over a wind-tossed field of oats. No color that was visible anywhere was quite natural. All tints were charged with a leaden tinge from the solid cloud bank overhead. The river was leaden, all distances the same, and even the far-reaching ranks of combing whitecaps were dully shaded by the dark, rich atmosphere through which their swarming legions marched. The thunder peals were constant and deafening. Explosion followed explosion, with but inconsequential intervals between, and the reports grew steadily sharper and higher-keyed and more trying to the ear. The lightning was as diligent as the thunder, and produced effects which enchanted the eyes and set electric ecstasies of mixed delight and apprehension shivering along every nerve in the body in unintermittent procession. The rain poured down in amazing volume. The ear-splitting thunder peals broke nearer and nearer. The wind increased in fury and began to wrench off boughs and treetops and send them sailing away through space. The pilot-house fell to rocking and straining and cracking and surging, and I went down in the hold to see what time it was. People boast a good deal about alpine thunderstorms, but the storms which I have had the luck to see in the Alps were not the equals of some which I have seen in the Mississippi Valley. I may not have seen the Alps do their best, of course, and if they can beat the Mississippi, I don't wish to. On this up-trip, I saw a little towhead, an infant island, half a mile long, which had been formed during the past 19 years. Since there was so much time to spare that 19 years of it could be devoted to the construction of a mere towhead, where was the use originally in rushing this whole globe through in 6 days? It's likely that if more time had been taken in the first place, the world would have been made right, and this ceaseless improving and repairing wouldn't be necessary now. But if you hurry a world or a house, you are nearly sure to find out by and by that you've left out a towhead or a broom closet or some other little convenience here and there, which had got to be supplied, no matter how much expense or vexation it may cost. We had a succession of black nights going up the river,
and it was observable that whenever we landed and suddenly inundated the trees with the intense sunburst of the electric light, a certain curious effect was always produced. Hundreds of birds flocked instantly out from the masses of shining green foliage and went careering hither and thither through the white rays, and often a songbird tuned up and fell to singing. We judged that they mistook this superb artificial day for the genuine article. We had a delightful trip in that thoroughly well-ordered steamer, and regretted that it was accomplished so speedily. By means of diligence and activity, we managed to hunt out nearly all the old friends. One was missing, however. He went to his reward, whatever it was, 2 years ago. But I found out all about him. His case helped me to realize how lasting can be the effect of a very trifling occurrence. When he was an apprenticed blacksmith in our village, and I a schoolboy, a couple of young Englishmen came to the town and sojourned a while. And one day they got themselves up in cheap royal finery and did the Richard III sword fight with maniac energy and prodigious powwow in the presence of the village boys. This blacksmith cub was there, and the histrionic poison entered his bones. This vast, lumbering, ignorant, dull-witted lout was stage-struck, and irrevocably. He disappeared, and presently turned up in St. Louis. I ran across him there by and by. He was standing musing on a street corner, with his right hand on his hip, the thumb of his left supporting his chin, his face bowed and frowning, slouch hat pulled down over his forehead, imagining himself to be Othello or some such character, and imagining that the passing crowd marked his tragic bearing and were awestruck. I joined him and tried to get him down out of the clouds, but did not succeed. However, he casually informed me presently that he was a member of the Walnut Street Theatre Company, and he tried to say it with indifference, but the indifference was thin, and a mighty exultation showed through it. He said he was cast for a part in Julius Caesar for that night, and if I should come, I would see him. If I should come, I said I wouldn't miss it if I were dead. I went away stupefied with astonishment, and saying to myself, how strange it is. We always thought this fellow a fool. Yet the moment he comes to a great city, where intelligence and appreciation abound, the talent concealed in this shabby napkin is at once discovered, and promptly welcomed and honored. But I came away from the theater that night disappointed and offended, for I'd had no glimpse of my hero, and his name was not in the bills. I met him on the street next morning, and before I could speak he asked, "Did you see me?" "No, you weren't there." He looked surprised and disappointed. He said, "Yes, I was. Indeed I was. I was a Roman soldier." "Which one?" "Well, didn't you see them Roman soldiers that stood back there in a rank and sometimes marched in procession around the stage?" "You mean the Roman army? Those 6-sandaled roustabouts in nightshirts with tin shields and helmets that marched around treading on each other's heels in charge of a spider-legged consumptive dressed like themselves?" That's it. I was one of them Roman soldiers. I was the next to the last one. Half a year ago I used to always be the last one, but I've been promoted." Well, they told me that that poor fellow remained a Roman soldier to the last, a matter of 34 years. Sometimes they cast him for a speaking part, but not an elaborate one. He could be trusted to go and say, "My lord, the carriage waits." But if they ventured to add a sentence or two to this, his memory felt the strain, and he was likely to miss fire. Yet, poor devil, he'd been patiently studying the part of Hamlet for more than 30 years, and he lived and died in the belief that someday he'd be invited to play it. And this is what came of that fleeting visit of those young Englishmen to our village, such ages and ages ago. What noble horseshoes this man might have made but for those Englishmen, and what an inadequate Roman soldier he did make. A day or two after we reached St. Louis, I was walking along 4th Street, when a grizzly-headed man gave a sort of start as he passed me, then stopped, came back, inspected me narrowly, with a clouding brow, and finally said with deep asperity, "Look here, Have you got that drink yet?" A maniac, I judged at first. But all in a flash I recognized him. I made an effort to blush that strained every muscle in me, and answered as sweetly and winningly as ever I knew how, "Been a little slow, but I'm just this minute closing in on the place where they keep it. Come in and help." He softened and said, "Make it a bottle of champagne," and he was agreeable. He said he'd seen my name in the papers, and had put all his affairs aside and turned out, resolved to find me or die, and make me answer that question satisfactorily or kill me, though the most of his late asperity had been rather counterfeit than otherwise. This meeting brought back to me the St. Louis riots of about 30 years ago. I spent a week there at that time, in a boarding house, and had this young fellow for a neighbor across the hall. We saw some of the fightings and killings, and by we went one night to an armory where 200 young men had met, upon call, to be armed and go forth against the rioters under command of a military man. We drilled till about 10 o'clock at night. Then news came that the mob were in great force in the lower end of the town and were sweeping everything before them. Our column moved at once. It was a very hot night, and my musket was very heavy. We marched, and the nearer we approached the seat of war, the hotter I grew and the thirstier I got. I was behind my friend. So finally, I asked him to hold my musket while I dropped out and got a drink. Then I branched off and went home. I was not feeling any solicitude about him, of course, because I knew he was so well armed now that he could take care of himself without any trouble. If I'd had any doubts about that, I would have borrowed another musket for him. I left the city pretty early the next morning, and if this grizzled man had not happened to encounter my name in the papers the other day in St. Louis, and felt moved to seek me out, I should have carried to my grave a heart-torturing uncertainty as to whether he ever got out of the riots all right or not. I ought to have inquired 30 years ago. I know that. And I would have inquired if I'd had the muskets. But in the circumstances, he seemed better fixed to conduct the investigations than I was. One Monday, near the time of our visit to St. Louis, the Globe Democrat came out with a couple of pages of Sunday statistics, whereby it appeared that 119,448 St. Louis people attended the morning and evening church services the day before, and 23,102 children attended Sunday school. Thus, 142,550 persons out of the city's total of 400,000 population respected the day religious-wise. I found these statistics in a condensed form in a telegram of the Associated Press and preserved them. They made it apparent that St. Louis was in a higher state of grace than she could have claimed to be in my time. But now that I canvassed the figures narrowly, I suspect that the telegraph mutilated them. It cannot be that there are more than 150,000 Catholics in the town. The other 250,000 must be classified as Protestants. Out of these 250,000, according to this questionable telegram, only 26,362 attended church and Sunday school, while out of the 150,000 Catholics, 116,188 went to church and Sunday school.
This ends Disc 10. Life on the Mississippi, Disc 11.
Chapter 52. A Burning Brand. All at once the thought came into my mind, I have not sought out Mr. Brown. Upon that text I desired to depart from the direct line of my subject and make a little excursion. I wish to reveal a secret which I have carried with me 9 years and which has become burdensome. Upon a certain occasion 9 years ago, I had said with strong feeling, "If I ever see St. Louis again, I will seek out Mr. Brown, the great grain merchant, and ask of him the privilege of shaking him by the hand." The occasion and the circumstances were as follows.
A friend of mine, a clergyman, came one evening and said, "I have a most remarkable letter here, which I want to read to you, if I can do it without breaking down. I must preface it with some explanations, however. The letter was written by an ex-thief and ex-vagabond of the lowest origin and basest rearing, a man all stained with crime and steeped in ignorance, but, thank God, with a mine of pure gold hidden away in him. His letter is written to a burglar named Williams, who is serving a 9-year term in a certain state prison for burglary. Williams was a particularly daring burglar and plied that trade during a number of years, but he was caught at last and jailed to await trial in a town where he'd broken into a house at night, pistol in hand, and forced the owner to hand over to him $8,000 in government bonds. Williams was not a common sort of person by any means. He was a graduate of Harvard College and came of good New England stock. His father was a clergyman. While lying in jail, his health began to fail, and he was threatened with consumption. This fact, together with the opportunity for reflection afforded by solitary confinement, had its effect, its natural effect. He fell into serious thought. His early training asserted itself with power, and wrought with strong influence upon his mind and heart. He put his old life behind him and became an earnest Christian. Some ladies in the town heard of this, visited him, and by their encouraging words supported him in his good resolutions and strengthened him to continue in his new life. The trial ended in his conviction and sentence to the state prison for the term of 9 years, as I have before said. In the prison, he became acquainted with the poor wretch referred to in the beginning of my talk, Jack Hunt, the writer of the letter which I am going to read to you. You will see that the acquaintanceship bore fruit for Hunt. When Hunt's time was out, he wandered to St. Louis, and from that place he wrote his letter to Williams. The letter got no further than the office of the prison warden, of course. Prisoners are not often allowed to receive letters from outside. The prison authorities read this letter, but did not destroy it. They had not the heart to do it. They read it to several persons, and eventually it fell into the hands of those ladies of whom I spoke a while ago. The other day I came across an old friend of mine, a clergyman, who had seen this letter and was full of it. The mere remembrance of it so moved him that he could not talk of it without his voice breaking. He promised to get a copy of it for me, and here it is, an exact copy with all the imperfections of the original preserved. It has many slang expressions in it, thieves' argot, but their meaning has been interlined in parenthesis by the prison authorities. St. Louis, June 9th, 1872. Mr. Williams, friend Charlie, if I may call you so. I know you were surprised to get a letter from me, but I hope you won't be mad at my writing to you. I want to tell you my thanks for the way you talked to me when I was in prison. It's led me to try and be a better man. I guess you thought I didn't care for what you said, and at the first go-off I didn't. But I knowed you was a man who had done big work with good men and want no succor, nor want gassin', and all the boys knowed it. I used to think at night what you said, and for it I knocked off swearing 5 months before my time was up, for saw it warn't no good nohow. The day my time was up, you told me if I'd shake the cross, that is, quit stealing, and live on the square for 3 months, it'd be the best job I ever done in my life. State agent give me a ticket to here, and on the car I thought more of what you said to me, but didn't make up my mind. When I got to Chicago, on the cars from there to here, I pulled off an old woman's leather, that is, robbed her of her pocketbook. I hadn't no more than got it off when I wished I hadn't done it. For a while before that I made up my mind to be a square bloke for 3 months, on your word, but I forgot it when I saw the leather was a grip. That is, easy to get. But I kept close to her, and when she got out of the cars at a way place, I said, "Ma'am, have you lost anything?" And she tumbled. That is, discovered. Her leather was off. Or gone. "Is this it?" says I, giving it to her. "Well, if you ain't honest," says she, but I hadn't got cheek enough to stand that sort of talk, so I left her in a hurry. When I got here, I had $1.25 left, and I didn't get no work for 3 days, as I ain't strong enough for a roustabout on a steamboat. That is, for a deckhand. The afternoon of the third day, I spent my last 10 cents for 2 moons, large, round sea biscuits, and cheese, and I felt pretty rough and was thinking I'd have to go on the dip. Picking pockets, that is. Again, when I thought of what you once said about a fella calling on the Lord when he was in hard luck, and I thought I'd try it once anyhow. But when I tried it, I got stuck on the start, and all I could get off was, "Lord, give a poor fella a chance to square it for 3 months, for Christ's sake, amen." And I kept thinking it over and over as I went along. About an hour after that, I was in 4th Street, and this is what happened, and is the cause of my being where I am now, and about which I will tell you before I get done writing. As I was walking along, I heard a big noise and saw a horse running away with a carriage with 2 children in it, and I grabbed up a piece of box cover from the sidewalk and run in the middle of the street, and when the horse came up, I smashed him over the head as hard as I could drive. The board split to pieces, and the horse checked up a little, and I grabbed the reins and pulled his head down till he stopped. The gentleman what owed him came running up, and soon he saw the children were all right. He shook hands with me and give me a $50 greenback. And my asking the Lord to help me came into my head, and I was so thunderstruck I couldn't drop the reins nor say nothing. He saw something was up, and coming back to me said, "My boy, are you hurt?" And the thought come into my head just then to ask him for work, and I asked him to take back the bill and give me a job. Says he, "Jump here and let's talk about it, but keep the money." He asked me if I could take care of horses, and I said yes, for I used to hang around livery stables and often had helped clean and drive horses. He told me he wanted a man for that work and would give me $16 a month and board me. You bet I took that chance at once. That night in my little room over the stable, I sat a long time thinking over my past life and what had just happened, and I just got down on my knees and thanked the Lord for the job and to help me to square it, and to bless you for putting me up to it. And the next morning I done it again and got me some new togs, that is, clothes, and a Bible, for I made up my mind after what the Lord done for me, I'd read the Bible every night and morning and ask him to keep an eye on me. When I'd been there about a week, Mr. Brown, that's his name, came in my room one night and saw me reading the Bible. He asked me if I was a Christian. I told him no. He asked me how it was I read the Bible instead of papers and books. Well, Charlie, I thought I'd better give him a square deal in the start, so I told him all about my being in prison and about you and how I'd almost done give up looking for work and how the Lord got me the job when I asked him, and the only way I had to pay him back was to read the Bible and square it. And I asked him to give me a chance for 3 months. Yeah, he talked to me like a father for a long time and told me I could stay, and then I felt better than ever I had done in my life, for I had given Mr. Brown a fair start with me, and now I didn't fear no one giving me a back cap, that is, exposing his past life, and running me off the job. Next morning he called me into the library and gave me another square talk and advised me to study some every day. He'd help me 1 or 2 hours every night, and he gave me a arithmetic, a spelling book, a geography, and a writing book. And he hears me every night. He lets me come into the house to prayers every morning and got me put in a Bible class in the Sunday school, which I like very much, for it helps me to understand my Bible better. Now, Charlie, the 3 months on the square are up 2 months ago. And as you said, it's the best job I ever did in my life. And I commenced another of the same sort right away, only it is to God helping me to last a lifetime, Charlie. I wrote this letter to tell you I do think God has forgiven my sins and heard your prayers, for you told me you should pray for me. I know I love to read his word and tell him all my troubles, and he helps me, I know, for I've plenty of chances to steal, but I don't feel as I once did, and now I take more pleasure in going to church and then to the theater, and that wasn't so once. Our ministers and others often talk with me, and a month ago they wanted me to join the church, but I said, no, not now. I may be mistaken in my feelings, and I'll wait a while. But now I feel that God has called me, and on the first Sunday in July I'll join the church. Dear friend, I wish I could write to you as I feel, but I can't do it yet. You know, I learned to read and write while in prison, and I ain't got well enough along to write as I would talk. I know I ain't spelled all the words right in this and lots of other mistakes, but you'll excuse it, I know. For you know I was brought up in a poor house until I run away, and that I never knew who my father and mother was, and I don't know my right name, and I hope you won't be mad at me. But I have as much right to one name as another, and I've taken your name, for you won't use it when you get out, I know, and you're the man I think most of in the world, so I hope you won't be mad. I'm doing very well. I put $10 a month in the bank, with 25 of the 50. If you ever want any or all of it, let me know, and it's all yours. I wish you'd let me send you some now. I send you with this a receipt for a year of Little's living age. I didn't know what you would like, and I told Mr. Brown, and he said he thought you'd like it. I wish I was near you so I could send you Chuck, that is, refreshments, on holidays. It'd spoil this weather from here. But I will send you a box next Thanksgiving anyway. Next week Mr. Brown takes me into his store as late porter and will advance me as soon as I know a little more. He keeps a big granary store, wholesale. I forgot to tell you, my mission school, Sunday school class. The school is in the Sunday afternoon. I went out 2 Sunday afternoons and picked up 7 kids and got 'em to come in. 2 of 'em knew as much as I did, and I had 'em put in a class where they could learn something. I don't know much myself, but these kids can't read. I get on nicely with 'em. I make sure of 'em by going after 'em every Sunday, half-hour before school time. I also got 4 girls to come. Tell Mac and Harry about me. If they'll come out here when their time is up, I'll get 'em jobs at once. I hope you'll excuse this long letter and all mistakes. I wish I could see you, for I can't write as I'd talk. I hope the warm weather's doing your lungs good. I was afraid when you was bleeding you'd die. Give my respects to all the boys, and tell 'em how I'm doing. I'm doing well, and everyone here treats me as kind as they can. Mr. Brown's going to write to you sometime. I hope someday you'll write me. This letter is from your very true friend, Charlie Williams, who you knew as Jack Hunt. I send you Mr. Brown's card. Send my letter to him. Here was irresistible eloquence, and without a single grace or ornament to help it out. I've seldom been so deeply stirred by any piece of writing. The reader of it halted all the way through on a lame and broken voice. Yet he had tried to fortify his feelings by several private readings of the letter before venturing into company with it. He was practicing upon me to see if there was any hope of his being able to read the document to his prayer meeting with anything like a decent command over his feelings. The result was not promising. However, he determined to risk it, and he did. He got through tolerably well, but his audience broke down early and stayed in that condition to the end. The fame of the letter spread through the town. A brother minister came and borrowed the manuscript, put it bodily into a sermon, preached the sermon to 1,200 people on a Sunday morning, and the letter drowned them in their own tears. Then my friend put it into a sermon and went before his Sunday morning congregation with it. It scored another triumph. The house wept as one individual. My friend went on a summer vacation up into the fishing regions of our northern British neighbors, and carried the sermon with him, since he might possibly chance to need a sermon. He was asked to preach one day. The little church was full. Among the people present were the late Dr. J.G. Holland, the late Mr. Seymour of the New York Times, Mr. Page, the philanthropist and temperance advocate, and, I think, Senator Fry of Maine. The marvelous letter did its wonted work. All the people were moved, all the people wept. The tears flowed in a steady stream down Dr. Holland's cheeks, and nearly the same can be said with regard to all who were there. Mr. Page was so full of enthusiasm over the letter that he said he would not rest until he made a pilgrimage to that prison and had speech with the man who had been able to inspire a fellow unfortunate to write so priceless a tract. Ah, that unlucky page. And another man. If they had only been in Jericho, that letter would have rung through the world and stirred all the hearts of all the nations for 1,000 years to come, and nobody might ever have found out that it was the confoundedest, brazenest, ingeniousest piece of fraud and humbuggery that was ever concocted to fool poor, confiding mortals with. The letter was a pure swindle, and that is the truth. And take it by and large, it was without a compeer among swindles. It was perfect. It was rounded, symmetrical, complete, colossal. The reader learns it at this point, but we didn't learn it till some miles and weeks beyond this stage of the affair. My friend came back from the woods, and he and other clergymen and lay missionaries began once more to inundate audiences with their tears and the tears of said audiences. I begged hard for permission to print the letter in a magazine and tell the watery story of its triumphs. Numbers of people got copies of the letter, with permission to circulate them in writing, but not in print. Copies were sent to the Sandwich Islands and other far regions. Charles Dudley Warner was at church one day. When the Warren letter was read and wept over, at the church door, afterward, he dropped a peculiarly cold iceberg down the clergyman's back with the question, "Do you know that letter to be genuine?" It was the first suspicion that had ever been voiced, but it had that sickening effect which first uttered suspicions against one's idol always have. Some talk followed. "Why, what should make you suspect that it isn't genuine?" "Nothing that I know of, except that it's too neat and compact and fluent and nicely put together for an ignorant person, an unpracticed hand. I think it was done by an educated man." The literary artist had detected the literary machinery. If you look at the letter now, you'll detect it yourself. It is observable in every line. Straightway the clergyman went off, with this seed of suspicion sprouting in him, and wrote to a minister residing in that town where Williams had been jailed and converted. Asked for light, and also asked if a person in the literary line, meaning me, might be allowed to print the letter and tell its history. He presently received this answer. "My dear friend, in regard to that convict's letter, there can be no doubt as to its genuineness. Williams, to whom it was written, lay in our jail and professed to have been converted, and our chaplain had great faith in the genuineness of the change, as much as one can have in any such case. The letter was sent to one of our ladies, who is a Sunday school teacher, sent either by Williams himself or the chaplain of the state's prison, probably. She has been greatly annoyed in having so much publicity, lest it might seem a breach of confidence, or be an injury to Williams. In regard to its publication, I can give no permission, though if the names and places were omitted, and especially if sent out of the country, I think you might take the responsibility and do it. It is a wonderful letter, which no Christian genius, much less one unsanctified, could ever have written. As showing the work of grace in a human heart, and in a very degraded and wicked one, it proves its own origin, and reproves our weak faith in its power to cope with any form of wickedness. Mr. Brown of St. Louis, someone said, was a Hartford man. Do all whom you send from Hartford serve their master as well? P.S. Williams is still in the state's prison, serving out a long sentence, of 9 years, I think. He has been sick and threatened with consumption, but I have not inquired after him lately. This lady that I speak of corresponds with him, I presume, and will be quite sure to look after him. This letter arrived a few days after it was written, and up went Mr. Williams's stock again. Mr. Warner's low-down suspicion was laid in the cold, cold grave where it apparently belonged. It was a suspicion based upon mere internal evidence, anyway. And when you come to internal evidence, it's a big field and a game that two can play at. As witness this other internal evidence discovered by the writer of the note, that it is a wonderful letter which no Christian genius, much less one unsanctified, could ever have written. I had permission now to print, provided I suppressed names and places and sent my narrative out of the country. So I chose an Australian magazine for vehicle, as being far enough out of the country, and set myself to work on my article. And the ministers set the pumps going again, with a letter to work the handles. But meantime, Brother Page had been agitating. He had not visited the penitentiary, but he had sent a copy of the illustrious letter to the chaplain of that institution, and accompanied it with, apparently, inquiries. He got an answer, dated 4 days later than the other brother's reassuring epistle, and before my article was complete, it wandered into my hands. The original is before me now, and I here append it. It is pretty well loaded with internal evidence of the most solid description. State's Prison, Chaplain's Office, July 11, 1873. Dear Brother Page, herewith, please find the letter kindly loaned me. I am afraid its genuineness cannot be established. It purports to be addressed to some prisoner here. No such letter ever came to a prisoner here. All letters received are carefully read by officers of the prison before they go into the hands of the convicts, and any such letter could not be forgotten. Again, Charles Williams is not a Christian man, but a dissolute, cunning prodigal, whose father is a minister of the gospel. His name is an assumed one. I am glad to have made your acquaintance. I am preparing a lecture upon life seen through prison bars, and should like to deliver the same in your vicinity. And so ended that little drama. My poor article went into the fire, for whereas the materials for it were now more abundant and infinitely richer than they had previously been, there were parties all around me who, although longing for the publication before, were a unit for suppression at this stage and complexion of the game. They said, "Wait, the wound is too fresh yet." All the copies of the famous letter, except mine, disappeared suddenly, and from that time onward the aforetime same old drought set in the churches. As a rule, the town was on a spacious grin for a while, but there were places in it where the grin did not appear, and where it was dangerous to refer to the ex-convict's letter. A word of explanation. Jack Hunt, the professed writer of the letter, was an imaginary person. The burglar Williams, Harvard graduate, son of a minister, wrote the letter himself, to himself, got it smuggled out of the prison, got it conveyed to persons who had supported and encouraged him in his conversion, where he knew two things would happen. The genuineness of the letter would not be doubted or inquired into, and the nub of it would be noticed, and would have valuable effect, the effect, indeed, of starting a movement to get Mr. Williams pardoned out of prison. That nub is so ingeniously, so casually flung in, and immediately left there in the tail of the letter, undwelt upon, that an indifferent reader would never suspect that it was the heart and core of the epistle. If he even took note of it at all, this is the nub. I hope the warm weather is doing your lungs good. I was afraid when you was bleeding you would die. Give my respects, etc. That is all there is of it. Simply touch and go, no dwelling upon it. Nevertheless, it was intended for an eye that would be swift to see it, and it was meant to move a kind heart to try to effect the liberation of a poor, reformed, and purified fellow lying in the fell grip of consumption. When I for the first time heard that letter read 9 years ago, I felt that it was the most remarkable one I'd ever encountered, and it so warmed me toward Mr. Brown of St. Louis that I said that if I ever visited that city again, I would seek out that excellent man and kiss the hem of his garment, if it was a new one. Well, I visited St. Louis, but I did not hunt for Mr. Brown, for, alas, the investigation of long ago had proved that the benevolent Brown, like Jack Hunt, was not a real person, but a sheer invention of that gifted rascal, Williams, burglar, Harvard graduate, son of a clergyman. Chapter 53. My Boyhood Home. We took passage in one of the fast boats of the St. Louis and St. Paul Packet Company and started up the river. When I, as a boy, first saw the mouth of the Missouri River, it was 22 or 23 miles above St. Louis, according to the estimate of pilots. The wear and tear of the banks has moved it down 8 miles since then, and the pilots say that within 5 years the river will cut through and move the mouth down 5 miles more, which will bring it within 10 miles of St. Louis. About nightfall, we passed the large and flourishing town of Alton, Illinois, and before daylight next morning, the town of Louisiana, Missouri, a sleepy village in my day, but a brisk railway center now. I could not clearly recognize the place. This seemed odd to me, for when I retired from the rebel army in '61, I retired upon Louisiana in good order, at least in good enough order for a person who had not yet learned how to retreat according to the rules of war, and had to trust to native genius. It seemed to me that for a first attempt at a retreat it was not badly done. I had done no advancing in all that campaign that was at all equal to it. At 7 in the morning, we reached Hannibal, Missouri, where my boyhood was spent. I'd had a glimpse of it 15 years ago, and another glimpse 6 years earlier, but both were so brief that they hardly counted. The only notion of the town that remained in my mind was the memory of it as I had known it when I first quitted it 29 years ago. That picture of it was still as clear and vivid to me as a photograph. I stepped ashore with the feeling of one who returned out of a dead and gone generation. I had a sort of realizing sense of what the Bastille prisoners must have felt when they used to come out and look upon Paris after years of captivity, and note how curiously the familiar and the strange were mixed together before them. I saw the new houses, saw them plainly enough, but they did not affect the older pictures in my mind, for through their solid bricks and mortar I saw the vanished houses, which had formerly stood there with perfect distinctness. It was Sunday morning, and everybody was abed yet. So I passed through the vacant streets, still seeing the town as it was, and not as it is, and recognizing and metaphorically shaking hands with 100 familiar objects which no longer exist, and finally climbed Holliday's Hill to get a comprehensive view. The whole town lay spread out below me then, and I could mark and fix every locality, every detail. Naturally, I was a good deal moved. I said, many of the people I once knew in this tranquil refuge of my childhood are now in heaven. Some, I trust, are in the other place. The things about me and before me made me feel like a boy again, convinced me that I was a boy again, and that I'd simply been dreaming an unusually long dream. But my reflections spoiled all that, for they forced me to say, I see 50 old houses down yonder, into each of which I could enter and find either a man or a woman who was a baby or unborn when I noticed those houses last, or a grandmother who was a plump young bride at that time. From this vantage ground, the extensive view up and down the river, and wide over the wooded expanses of Illinois, is very beautiful, one of the most beautiful on the Mississippi, I think. It may be that my affection for the one in question biases my judgment in its favor. I cannot say as to that. No matter. It was satisfyingly beautiful to me, and it had this advantage over all the other friends whom I was about to meet again. It had suffered no change. It was as young and fresh and comely and gracious as ever it had been, whereas the faces of the others would be old and scarred with the campaigns of life, and marked with their griefs and defeats, and would give me no upliftings of spirit. An old gentleman, out on an early morning walk, came along, and we discussed the weather, and then drifted into other matters. I could not remember his face. He said he had been living here 28 years, so he had come after my time, and I had never seen him before. I asked him various questions. First, about a mate of mine in Sunday school. What became of him? He graduated with honor in an Eastern college, wandered off into the world somewhere, succeeded at nothing, passed out of knowledge and memory years ago, and is supposed to have gone to the dogs. He was bright and promised well when he was a boy. Yes, but the thing that happened is what became of it all. I asked after another lad, altogether the brightest in our village school when I was a boy. He, too, was graduated with honors from an Eastern college, but life whipped him in every battle, straight along, and he died in one of the territories years ago, a defeated man. I asked after another of the bright boys. He's a success. Always has been. Always will be, I think. I inquired after a young fellow who came to the town to study for one of the professions when I was a boy. He went at something else before he got through. He went from medicine to law, or from law to medicine, then to some other new thing. Went away for a year, came back with a young wife, fell to drinking, then gambling behind the door, finally took his wife and 2 children to her father's and went off to Mexico. Went from bad to worse, and finally died there, without a cent to buy a shroud, or without a friend to attend the funeral. Pity, but he was the best-natured and most cheery and hopeful young fellow that ever was. I named another boy. Oh, he's all right. Lives here yet. Has a wife and children. Is prospering. Same verdict concerning other boys. I named 3 schoolgirls. Well, the first 2 live here, are married and have children. The others long ago dead, never married. I named with emotion one of my early sweethearts. She's all right. Been married 3 times, married 2 husbands, divorced from the 3rd, and I hear she's getting ready to marry an old fella out there in Colorado somewhere. She's got children scattered around here and there, most everywheres. The answer to several other inquiries was brief and simple. Killed in the war. I named another boy. Well, now, his case is curious. There wasn't a human being in this town but knew that that boy was a perfect chucklehead, perfect dummy, just a stupid ass, as you might say. Everybody knew it, and everybody said it. Well, if that very boy isn't the first lawyer in the state of Missouri today, I'm a Democrat. Is that so? It's actually so. I'm telling you the truth. How do you account for it? Account for it? Ain't any accounting for it, except that if you send a damned fool to St. Louis and you don't tell him he's a damned fool, they'll never find out. There's one thing sure. If I had a damned fool, I should know what to do with him. Ship him to St. Louis. It's the noblest market in the world for that kind of property. Well, when you come to look at it all around and chew at it and think it over, don't it just bang anything you ever heard of? Well, yes, it does seem to. But don't you think maybe it was the Hannibal people who were mistaken about the boy and not the St. Louis people? Ah, nonsense. People here have known him from the very cradle. They knew him 100 times better than the St. Louis idiots could have known him. Now, if you got any damned fools that you want to realize on, take my advice, send them to St. Louis. I mentioned a great number of people whom I had formerly known. Some were dead, some were gone away, some had prospered, some had come to naught. But as regarded a dozen or so of the lot, the answer was comforting. Prosperous. Live here yet. Towns littered with their children. I asked about a certain miss. Died in the insane asylum 3 or 4 years ago. Never was out of it from the time she went in, and was always suffering, too. Never got a shred of her mind back. If he spoke the truth, here was a heavy tragedy indeed. 36 years in a madhouse that some young fools might have some fun. I was a small boy at the time, and I saw those giddy young ladies come tiptoeing into the room where this girl sat reading at midnight by a lamp. The girl at the head of the file wore a shroud and a dough face. She crept behind the victim, touched her on the shoulder, and she looked up and screamed and then fell into convulsions. She didn't recover from the fright, but went mad, In those days it seems incredible that people believed in ghosts so short a time ago, but they did. After asking after such other folk as I could call to mind, I finally inquired about myself. "Oh, he succeeded well enough. Another case of a damned fool. If they'd sent him to St. Louis, he'd have succeeded sooner." It was with much satisfaction that I recognized the wisdom of having told this candid gentleman in the beginning that my name was Smith.